There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response. There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response. There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response.
Welcome to the 32nd Vigil for Julian Assange. I'm Joe Loria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. I'm joined by Elizabeth Voss, contributor to Consortium News. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi, Joe. Good to be here. How are
you?
Clearly,
I'm fine. Clearly the major story today, as we had last Friday, a major story with the indictment under the Espionage Act. Today, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture has issued his report, or at least a statement about his report, and it's a stinging rebuke to the United States, Great Britain, Sweden, and Ecuador. He names these countries. He blames them for deliberately exposing Julian Assange to years of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment which says can only be described as psychological torture. Now, Mr. Niles Meltzer visited Julian on May 9th at Belmarsh Prison. This is what he says. In 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. He says the collective persecution of Julian Assange must end here and now. The evidence is overwhelming and clear, he goes on. Mr. Assange has been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the cumulative effects of which can only be described as psychological torture. In the course of the past 9 years, Mr. Assange has been exposed to persistent, progressively severe abuse ranging from systemic judicial persecution and arbitrary confinement in the Ecuadorian embassy to his oppressive isolation, harassment, and surveillance inside the embassy, and from deliberate collective ridicule, insults, and humiliation to open instigation of violence and even calls for his assassination. It was obvious that Mr. Assange's health has been seriously affected by the extremely hostile and arbitrary environment he has been exposed to for many years. Most importantly, in addition to physical ailments, Mr. Assange showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety, and intense psychological trauma. This report was given to those 4 countries on Monday. The Sydney Morning Herald claims to have gotten a confidential copy of it. No one else has seen that. But I'm reading from the statement that was put out by the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, of which to wrap for his work. My most urgent concern, now, by the way, Elizabeth will be speaking next about Assange's health, what's happened to him, that we all know now he's been put into the prison hospital.
Right.
My most urgent concern, Niles Meltzer says, is that in the United States, Mr. Assange will be exposed to a real risk of serious violations of his human rights, including his freedom of expression, his right to a fair trial, and the prohibition of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. He said he was particularly alarmed by the charges under the Espionage Act. This may well result in a life sentence without parole, or possibly even the death penalty, if further charges were to be added in the future. He goes on to say, since 2010, when WikiLeaks started publishing evidence of war crimes and torture committed by U.S. forces, we have seen a sustained and concerted effort by several states towards getting Mr. Assange extradited to the United States for prosecution, raising serious concerns over the criminalization of investigative journalism in violation of both the U.S. Constitution and international human rights law. Now, the Herald, as I said, also interviewed Mr. Meltzer. He's been interviewed by the New York Times as well, by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And the Herald reports him saying that Assange is really something I've never seen in 20 years. I've seen atrocities in war areas that were physically more horrible, but I've never seen a single person pursued so relentlessly and with so little foundation. When I saw him, I immediately compared him to some of the graver cases in interrogation prisons in terms of his psychological reaction patterns. That's what alarmed me so much. He said his treatment was very close to intentional, purposeful infliction of coercive measures to try to break him. This is particularly disturbing. Meltzer says that Julian Assange appeared extremely agitated and preoccupied. He asked a lot of questions. This is when Meltzer saw him on May 9 with 2 doctors. He said he asked a lot of questions, and he would jump around. He was so preoccupied with everything, he can't even compute my answers anymore. There were episodes of this. Then he was part of the conversation as normal. Then again, he would enter into this agitated state. I have seen with other victims of psychological torture that would happen. He also criticized Australia, saying, quote, Australia is a glaring absence in this case. They are just not around, as if Assange was not an Australian citizen. That is not the correct way of dealing with that. A spokesman at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Canberra told the Sydney Morning Herald, quote, "We reject any suggestion by the UN Special Rapporteur or on torture that the Australian government is complicit in psychological torture or has shown a lack of consular support for Mr. Assange." Stronger than that was a refutation by Britain's Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. He condemned Meltzer for this report. Hunt said it was wrong for the rapporteur to interfere with British justice by uttering inflammatory accusations. Here's the full tweet from Jeremy Hunt. "This is wrong. Assange chose to hide in the embassy and was always free to leave and face justice. The UN Special Rapporteur should allow British courts to make their judgments without his interference or inflammatory accusations." That elicited this reply on Twitter from Mr. Meltzer. "With all due respect, sir, Mr. Assange was about as free to leave as someone sitting on a rubber boat in a shark pool. As detailed in my formal letter to you, so far UK courts have not shown the impartiality and objectivity required by the rule of law." Elizabeth.
Absolutely incredible. I thought it was shocking to hear that kind of description of Assange in that state. It's not surprising, but it's horrifying, deeply, deeply horrifying. So,
Indeed.
we have that,
And
that report out now.
the language could not be stronger from the rapporteur. He actually did the job he was supposed to do, in my view.
Yeah, and I think actually that's what surprises me more than anything in the report, unfortunately, is that he was willing to say this so bluntly. We have, additionally, this article regarding WikiLeaks' expression of concern over Assange's health, grave concern over Assange's health. It's from Consortium News, and we'll just be reading it now before we open this up to our guests. So WikiLeaks said on Wednesday that it was gravely concerned for the health of its publisher, Julian Assange, and questioned Britain's standing as a human rights abiding nation. WikiLeaks has condemned Britain for its treatment of Assange, expressing grave concerns for Assange, who has been transferred to the health ward of Belmarsh Prison in London. In a statement released on Twitter on Wednesday, the publication also condemned Ecuador for having created conditions incompatible with basic human rights for Assange, who had been granted asylum in its London embassy and remained there for almost 7 years. He was cut off for the last year from the internet with only minimal visits permitted. Assange is serving a 50-week sentence in the maximum security prison for skipping bail in 2012, when he was wanted for questioning by Sweden on sexual assault allegations. That year, he entered the Ecuador's embassy and remained there until British police were invited to arrest Assange on April 11th this year. He had sought asylum, fearing onward extradition from Sweden to the United States to face charges under the Espionage Act. As he predicted, the US filed an extradition request with Britain the day he was arrested, and last Thursday he was charged under the Espionage Act for possessing and disseminating classified information. Britain had twice ignored rulings by the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention that the UK should let Assange free and pay him compensation. The UK's refusal to abide by UN rulings and its subsequent treatment of Mr Assange since his arrest presents serious questions about the UK's standing as a human rights abiding nation, WikiLeaks said in its statement. Assange has been kept in isolation for 23 hours a day at Belmarsh and has been allowed only a handful of visits from his lawyers. The UN Special Rapporteur for Torture visited him with a doctor who examined Assange earlier this month. The rapporteur's report has not yet been released. But during the 7 weeks in Belmarsh prison, his health has continued to deteriorate and he has dramatically lost weight, WikiLeaks said. News that Assange's health had declined to the point that he would be transferred to the prison hospital was first reported by the Swedish daily Uppsala Nya Tidning, in which quoted Assange's Swedish lawyer, Per Samuelsson, saying that his client was so ill that a normal conversation with him was not possible. Samuelsson had requested, therefore, that Swedish authorities postpone a June 3rd hearing on a renewed Swedish extradition request to the UK on the sexual assault allegations, a request that was denied. We strongly condemn the refusal by the Swedish court to postpone a hearing on the 3rd of June on the basis of Mr Assange's health condition, WikiLeaks said. Here is the full statement from WikiLeaks, which I'll read now. WikiLeaks stated, quote, WikiLeaks has grave concerns about the state of health of our publisher, Julian Assange, who has been moved to the health ward of Belmarsh prison. Mr. Assange's health had already significantly deteriorated after 7 years inside the Ecuadorian embassy under conditions that were incompatible with basic human rights. The United Nations twice found him to have been arbitrarily detained and called on the UK to honour his commitments under the international law and free him. The UK's refusal to abide by UN rulings and its subsequent treatment of Mr. Assange since his arrest presents serious questions about the UK's standing as a human rights abiding nation. In his last year in the embassy, as the US finalized its extradition plans, Julian Assange was, at the behest of US authorities, totally isolated and gagged, a situation designed to make his life as hard as possible. During the 7 weeks in Belmarsh, his health had continued to deteriorate and he has dramatically lost weight. The decision of prison authorities to move him to the health ward speaks for itself. We strongly condemn the refusal by the Swedish court to postpone a hearing on the 3rd of June on the basis of Mr. Assange's health condition. Defense lawyer for Assange, Per Samuelson, said that Julian Assange's health state last Friday was such that it was not possible to conduct a normal conversation with him. Tomorrow, May 30th, there is a formal hearing in Westminster Court on the extradition request by the Trump administration. The initial US warrant has been expanded to include a life sentence or potential death penalty under the Espionage Act, announced last week in the superseding indictment, which disclosed 17 additional charges, bringing the potential sentence to 175 years in prison. The indictments have been widely condemned by free press organizations as the most serious attack against publishing activities in journalism. In modern times, the Trump administration, in essence, criminalizes the very act of journalism, and the indictment utilizes the archaic Espionage Act of 1917 to indict a publisher for the first time in history in an unprecedented escalation of the Trump administration's war on the free press. Kristen Hafrenson, WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, said, quote, Julian's case is of major historic significance. It will be remembered as the worst attack on press freedom in our lifetime. The people need to voice their condemnation. It is their politicians, their courts, their police, and their prisons that are being used in order to leave this black stain, abused in order to leave this black stain on history. Please act now to avert this shame. And that is the end of the statement. Joe, what are your thoughts on that?
Elizabeth. Yes, yeah. I just wanted to follow up in what you read was written, of course, before the rapporteur's report was released today. So when it says that it hadn't been released yet, it's referring to, in fact, to that report that was given to the British and American governments on Monday, and that has been made public, at least the contents, some of the contents, by the rapporteur himself in his statement. There's a link in Conservative News to that statement that you could read. Also, for some reason that he didn't explain, the rapporteur said that though Assange is 23 hours alone in a cell, he is not considered at solitary confinement. So I don't know if that's changed or if it wasn't the case when he was there, but that's just something I thought I'd add. We have one more news item before we begin discussing all of this in depth, and that is the New York Times reporting. I think this is an AP story, actually, in the New York Times, Associated Press. From today, Friday, lawyers for former Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning are renewing efforts to get her released from her Virginia jail. Manning's lawyers filed court papers Friday asking a federal judge to reconsider his decision to send Manning to the Alexandria jail for refusing to testify to a grand jury investigating WikiLeaks. Manning has been jailed for civil contempt since May 16. This follows a 2-month jail term this spring for refusing to testify to a previous grand jury. The court motion argues, this is interesting, that a new indictment of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, of course, that came out last Thursday, makes Manning's testimony irrelevant. The court papers also include a letter from Manning explaining why she views the grand jury as morally unacceptable. It adds, of course, that Manning spent 7 years in a military prison for delivering a trove of classified information to Assange. So it's just logical to ask, if this superseding indictment came out on Thursday, why are they holding her? What do they need from Chelsea Manning? Is there going to be a superseding indictment to supersede the superseding indictment? I mean, what else could they add? The only charges they seem to have left were to cook up to use this archaic law of the Espionage Act, particularly Section E, which says anybody in the world who possesses American and classified intelligence that is not authorized to do so, and also who disseminates that information, is liable to be prosecuted under this act. And that would include any person in the whole world who has retweeted, who has posted on Facebook, or has sent an email with an attachment from a document WikiLeaks has released that the U.S. government still considers classified. So it's under that law that Assange was indicted, and that caused this outcry from members of the mainstream media in the U.S. and elsewhere, not caring at all about Julian Assange as a person. They still took all these pot shots at him, but they're looking out for their own interests because they realize that if the indictment goes through, in other words, if he's prosecuted and he's actually tried in some fashion and is jailed, that they could be next because they've done the same thing. Many of these newspapers, like the New York Times and the Guardian, Der Spiegel, etc., actually partnered with WikiLeaks on these stories and published exact same classified information. So they, Elizabeth, this is my view, that the public opinion is turning even more in favor, or let's say against, the Trump administration, and now the British government as well, and the Swedes and Ecuador. When you combine that Espionage Act indictment and the reaction that engendered with this rapporteur's report, I'm finding it very hard to believe that he could be extradited from the UK or that he wouldn't win an appeal at the European Court of Human Rights. First of all, his health. Usually, right. The health of a prisoner is paramount to understand to whether or not he's able to be extradited or not. And would he be able to get a fair trial if in the condition that he's in? Number two, do they want to send a journalist to a country that's going to prosecute him for practicing investigative journalism, which is what he did. He did because that's what the indictment, if you read it carefully, explains, that he encouraged his source to get him information and he tried to hide his identity. That is what every journalist does. And now we have this torture report. If he's been treated like this so far in the embassy and now in the prison, will they want the European Court of Human Rights, would they want to allow him to go to the United States where, the U.S. has openly committed and practiced torture since 9/11? We have a president who has said during the campaign that he wants to do worse than waterboarding, that he likes torture. I mean, this is something hard to fathom, particularly since it's against U.S. law and international law to torture someone. So the rapporteur on torture did, in my view, his job, and he showed a lot of guts, especially at the end there, what I read when he stood up to Jeremy Hunt, Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So he's telling them, stick it. This is my job. I don't care how powerful your military, your ally, United States. I'm there to assess whether this man was tortured or not, and this is my assessment. He was psychologically tortured, and his physical health has declined rapidly. And he was. What I really find, Elizabeth, really incredibly stunning is the way he accuses these states of ganging up on an individual. I mean, that is very, very strong language that I've never seen a group of democratic states. I think that was a little twist there. Put the knife in and twist it. These are so-called democratic states ganging up on to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time. And later he says, without foundation.
I think it was brilliantly written, and I agree. I think that was shocking in a positive sense that he was willing to go that far and describe not just the medical sense in which Assange has suffered and is suffering under these conditions, but also discussed the death threats, the baseless smears, and the basic attacks on Assange over these years from the press, while he's been not only, confined arbitrarily, but also for that last year, gagged and unable to defend himself in any way. So I thought it was fantastic that he was able to describe that, as well as the strictly medical suffering that Assange has gone through. And we do have George Smuley and Sam Husseini with us, and I'd like to bring them in to discuss this news. Welcome, George, and thank you for joining us, and same to you, Sam. You should be able to speak with us in just a couple of seconds.
George, unmute yourself, George, and Sam.
Yeah, how are you?
Hello, George. Are you still in Pest?
Yes, I am. In
Okay.
Pest.
Good to have you with us. Sam was saying he's talking to us from the National Press Club, I think, in Washington. Is that right?
I'm actually at home in Maryland.
Home in Maryland. Okay, Sam. So why don't you guys, whoever wants to go first, about the news of the rapporteur, and we've already digested it for a couple of days, the news of Assange being hospitalized. But just your guys' reactions to the rapporteur's report. I guess you've had a chance to read some about it.
Yeah, I thought that it was a very powerful report. I mean, he was really absolutely unambiguous. There was no, there was almost, he wasn't doing any kind of being polite to the British government or anything like that. I mean, he really let them have it. And the tweet that you quoted to Jeremy Hunt was really powerful. So I think that was certainly extremely impressive, and really there's just no way around that. The question then is also what is his current health condition, because it's not at all clear. I mean, he's been moved to this. I don't know. I mean, is it a hospital? Is it a healthcare center? I don't know, but I assume that his health condition must be quite dire, because I don't think they would just, if he was suffering from flu or indigestion or whatever, I don't think they would have moved him there. So I think that his condition must be quite dire. And I do think that may be connected with the British government may be quite anxious that the Julian Assange may just die on them. And if he dies on them, then they've got a real public relations problem on their hands, because, I mean, of course, they can live with it, but nonetheless, it's a huge embarrassment, because Ecuador will doubtless turn around and say, hey, well, we surrendered him to you on the understanding that you would take care of him, you would provide him with proper first-rate health care, and look what you did. Now, of course, Ecuador can be silenced, but it'll cost a bit of money. I mean, Ecuador will certainly extract some moolah in return for these complaints. But nonetheless, there will be complaints. And there will be Europeans who will complain about this. And there will certainly be even moves within the United Nations to discuss what happened to Julian Assange. How did this come about? He was suddenly in prison and he's dead now. In the Security Council, yes, obviously Britain and the US have veto powers, but there will certainly be some discussions within the General Assembly, within the Human Rights Council. Huge embarrassment for the British government. And I think, given politicians are very short-term people, they don't want this embarrassment on their hands. Hence, I think the reason why this sudden shift, this move into the Belmarsh Hospital.
Sam.
This wasn't my primary motive for joining you this week, Joe, but I don't know. It's speculative, but Assange dying on them, though it obviously does have costs, is a relatively benign outcome for the establishment in Britain and in the United States. They tortured a guy basically to death because he published documents that exposed their war criminality, and he ends up going through this excruciating experience and then being dead. That's I think there is some costs, but I think that they're totally bearable by Britain, and they can say, look, we sent him to the hospital, we did what we could, so that could be a relatively benign outcome. Again, it's speculative, but we'll see. I certainly hope for his health and for everything to proceed as above board and legally as possible under these ridiculous circumstances.
George, you want to respond to that?
Well, I think I don't disagree with Sam. I think it'll be there will be a cost. It won't be an unbearable cost. But politicians, they don't tend to think in very long term. They think about the next few days. And if you're the May government and you have this embarrassing death on your hands, you at least know that the next 2 weeks are going to be quite painful for you. There will be some sort of an uproar about this, and you're going to have to answer some questions. Yeah, they will survive. I mean, it's not, the government won't fall on that, but it will be an embarrassment for them. But in terms of the relatively benign outcome, I mean, that's a possibility. I mean, would his death solve a lot of problems for the British government and the US government? Would this be at least, well, okay, well, that's it. I mean, that issue is now over. We don't have to go through the whole extradition thing. We don't have to do all of the trial and so on. Case closed. So, there may be that aspect to it. But I think in terms of how the British government has responded, I don't think at this stage they're actually ready to countenance his dying on them.
Well, I was kind of afraid that this conversation would go in this direction. The man, he's alive, and we really do hope that he's
absolutely
going to recover. Whether the British government, from George's point of view, wants him to recover so that they don't suffer this humiliation, or whether they might be better off if he didn't recover, is pure speculation. We can assume that he's been interrogated for the last 30 days, at least to some extent, because they got their hands on him. I don't think they're going to wait for him to be convicted and then, bring him to the States. The British government have to, of course, approve American interrogators to get in there. I have no evidence that happened, but that would not surprise me. And let's again hope that he's going to make it. Sam, you had another point you wanted to make. Please bring that forward at this point.
Sure. Again, somewhat speculative, but the whole arch of how things have gone compels me to wonder if, Barr is saying that there's no obstruction of justice.
Barr being the American Attorney General.
That's correct, vis-a-vis the Mueller report and so on. There's been this interesting interplay between what's gone on with Russiagate and how it's related to WikiLeaks, and how it has played out in terms of U.S. foreign policy. My hypothesis, and I say this somewhat reluctantly, but I think we need to discuss these things, is that Russiagate has been used as a bludgeon in different ways in order to push the Trump administration to ensure that it maintains as militaristic a foreign policy as possible, that it does not succumb to America first or other non-interventionist thinking. We've had the Trump administration basically, people brought on who are past associates of each other and who are diehard pro interventionist policies. Abrams, Barr, and they're significantly connected. Barr was Attorney General under Bush, and he pardoned Abrams. He facilitated the Bush pardon of Abrams because of the Iran-Contra scandal in 1992. I think that's a very compelling fact. And you also have other Bushites who have been brought into the Trump administration, Bolton, and so on, driving out of people who might have been, idiosyncratic, but not necessarily part of the standard U.S. Foreign policy establishment, most obviously Tillerson. And so you have the Republican establishment standing behind Trump, most obviously in the person of Barr, but also the Senate and so on. I really doubt that Barr would see things the same way if Trump were adopting a non-interventionist U.S. foreign policy. So this week, what did we see? We saw Mueller making his first public statements. He had 9 minutes. What did he do with those 9 minutes? He attacked WikiLeaks just days after Assange was indicted using the Espionage Act, an unprecedented act by the US government, a major assault on the First Amendment. And Mueller does this under the guise of being a straight-laced law and order man who's going to uphold the Constitution and who is telling Congress effectively impeach Trump for obstruction of justice relating to the non-proven and non-provable, probably, Russiagate conspiracy. And what do we see before that? We saw Trump backtracking from a militaristic posture regarding Bolton on both Korea and Iran. Now, I don't know that there's a connection there directly over the last week and a half, but I think that there is a significant connection that warrants examining between, at one level, how there's an obvious assault on not journalism in general, but journalism that will expose US foreign policy, right? I think that there's a lot of posturing from a lot of journalists now, even Rachel Maddow now is speaking out, allegedly in defense of Julian Assange, as if, the possibility of MSNBC or the New York Times publishing Trump's tax returns would be in any way similar to Julian Assange publishing evidence of US war crimes. They're not the same. This is not a general assault on journalism. I don't think, as people are saying, it is an assault on real journalism that actually exposes the core of US foreign policy criminality. So is this being used by the foreign policy establishment in order to ensure that Trump doesn't deviate from longstanding US militaristic foreign policy, and that he, in effect, becomes a sort of dead end of change, as Obama was? Obama promised change from the left from US foreign policy, and he didn't deviate fundamentally. And I think we're seeing the same thing with Trump. And I think that we're seeing Russiagate being used as at least one of the tools to ensure that that doesn't happen.
But what's interesting, just following up on what Sam has just said, is the role of Barr in all of this. Now, Barr is gone in public, and he said he's investigating the origins of Russiagate. Now, the origins of Russiagate is the top echelons of the FBI and the CIA colluding in order to thwart Trump, because they thought Trump would pursue a non-interventionist policy and a rapprochement with Russia. They absolutely were panicking. There was the foreign policy establishment in the summer of 2016 was panicking that this is the goal of the Trump administration. Trump and the foreign policy establishment absolutely hated him. That's the origins of Russiagate. Mueller took this over. Mueller essentially took over the entire that FBI investigation that was run by Comey, Strzok, and McCabe and all that. And when he came out the other day with the whole WikiLeaks thing and the evils of the Russian intervention, he's still continuing with that Russiagate line. That's not the position of Barr. I mean, Barr is actually saying that this was an illegitimate investigation. So he's in some ways more on the Trump side of things. He's saying that Trump was the unfair target of a deep state. He doesn't use obviously the term, but that there was a kind of a cabal of bureaucrats who wanted to thwart a political candidate who was pursuing a policy that they didn't like. So it's a nice question of then, where does Assange fit in all of this? And it may be that Barr doesn't actually isn't that sympathetic to the whole prosecution of Julian Assange. I mean, it started under Sessions. I mean, Sessions seemed to be much more enthusiastic about this prosecution. It's being led by these various characters who, Demers and so on. I don't know what Barr's role in all of this, but if Barr is clearly opposed to that whole cabal of FBI, CIA people who were trying to thwart Trump's non-interventionism, then I think Barr's role will be quite interesting in the Assange case.
Well, George, Barr is the head of the Justice Department. The Justice Department issued the indictment last Thursday under the Espionage Act. If he could have had something to do with holding that back.
Right,
so
but also, Barr was also Mueller's boss, and it's clear that Barr is not at all on Mueller's page. I mean, he openly upbraids Mueller and, Mueller's findings and, Mueller's statements. So we don't know exactly. I mean, look, you may be right. I mean, I'm not arguing with you. I'm just saying that Barr may be sort of playing a number of, juggling a number of balls in the air.
I think it's two separate issues. I think he could oppose Mueller in many ways and does believe there was spying going on led by the FBI, maybe the CIA. And he could also think Assange should be behind bars for exposing American war crimes. Because I think Barr is not, he's no radical here. He's very much an established man, a CIA man himself. We know that for sure. So he's spoken about it. So I think he wouldn't mind seeing Julian behind bars. But on the other hand, he thinks something fishy went on in the origin of the Russiagate investigation. I think he could hold those two ideas together in his mind. And he might even agree with Mueller saying that, Julian was responsible for, we had a disagreement about this, George, and now we can bring this out into the open now. My reading of the final report of Mueller is that Mueller blames Assange for knowing that the Russians were giving him these emails from the DNC and then Podesta, and that Assange, Mueller seems to, in my reading, say that Assange knew that Guccifer 2.0 and DC Leaks were actually GRU agents. I don't know how Assange would know that. The whole point of if it was a GRU, the whole point of using those so-called cutouts of these fake identities is to keep people from knowing that it was Russia. I wouldn't see why Russia wouldn't want Assange to know that it was them if it was them. So anyway, I think
your point is reasonable. I think there's an ambiguity about what Mueller is saying, because the way Mueller writes it is that there were news reports in the summer of 2016 that said that these emails that WikiLeaks was publishing, that these were stolen by the Russians. And then he says WikiLeaks sought to change the storyline by bringing up Seth Rich. He doesn't say that Assange knew who the source of this information was. You could interpret that's what Mueller is saying, but there may have been any other reason why Julian Assange may have wanted to, according to Mueller, put out this false story about Seth Rich. I mean, he may have thought he didn't like these stories being published, that it was all the Russians were behind this. But he doesn't actually say that Assange knew who the source was. And he even puts in the word apparently. So this was apparently Julian Assange sought to, divert these stories by floating the story about Seth Rich. So, you can certainly interpret it the way you interpret it. You could also interpret that Mueller doesn't say that Assange knew who the source of the emails was.
What I think we need to bear in mind is that I don't think that their positions are static. That is, in the report, he had the word apparently. When he made his remarks this week, that disappeared. And part of what I'm asking is the ambiguity functional on both Mueller's part and Barr's part? They're different, but they are, I think, both, completely part of the establishment, if not the very personification of it, and that they will use their pressure to ensure, and they will change their positions depending on Trump's foreign policy orientation. That is, if Barr is now going to pose as, being concerned that the deep state has taken over, was out to get Trump in 2016, and again, obviously he didn't use that term, but that the foreign policy that the U.S. establishment was attempting to undermine Trump because they feared that he would embrace a foreign policy that was sort of America first or non-interventionist in some way. Well, Trump obviously has not done that. Okay, I mean, he hasn't broken, he hasn't invaded Iran yet, he hasn't invaded Venezuela yet, but he's clearly is a general. I won't go through the list here. I think most of us are well aware of that. So the deep state fundamentally has swallowed the Trump administration. Now he can turn on them at any point. The Trump, I think, again, it's speculative, is a fundamentally non-ideological person who's totally in it for himself and is a compulsive liar and will do whatever suits him. So he could turn on them at any time, and he has a long history of turning on his business partners. They must be aware of that. So do they have this leverage of Russiagate on him? It's functional on a lot of levels. It demonizes Russia, which is functional in and of itself, vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis, a whole assortment of things. And it also says, we can turn on you, Trump. We can build this simmering, scandal into a full-blown impeachment if you get out of line. Lindsey Graham is towing Trump's line now. Do any of us think that Lindsey Graham would be doing this if Trump were not embracing a fundamentally interventionist foreign policy? I think not. Lindsey Graham is not acting on principle. Barr is not acting to uphold the law. Mueller is not acting to uphold the law.
Sam, they've lost some leverage with the fact there was no collusion found in that report, as much as Mueller was looking for it. They've lost that. And they're now holding over his head the idea that he may have tried to obstruct an investigation of something of which was no crime. There was no underlying crime, to use Barr's words. So he was trying, and Barr believes, and it seems that way to me, that Trump just wanted this witch hunt, as he calls it, to end. But ask what you think, Sam, Trump's views are about Assange. Does he care? Of course, he said he loved WikiLeaks during the campaign, and now he doesn't know anything about it anymore. How do you think he feels about this? His Justice Department indicted him under the Espionage Act. He has to take responsibility for that.
He does, and I think that Trump is fundamentally amoral person who's in it for himself. I don't think he's particularly ideological, at least relative to other people in the United States political establishment. And he rode WikiLeaks and all kinds of, anti-interventionist rhetoric during the campaign because it resonates with a large part of the U.S. public, which is sick and tired of continuous wars, which is sick and tired of the secrecy that those wars breed, and the civil liberties infringements that the government has been engaged in to facilitate those wars.
But that's a very interesting point, just to follow up on that, because what then happens as we move into the 2020 election? If Trump is really trailing badly in the polls, and it's quite likely he's going to be trailing by double digits to pretty much any Democrat that they're going to field, what is he going to do? I think he's going to try and go back to the themes of 2016. And I think he's going to revive the anti-interventionist. Sincere, insincere, doesn't matter, but he's going to have to fight for that re-election. So that becomes an interesting question. I mean, if he does return to the themes of 2016, brings back Steve Bannon and so on, then I think, your point's an interesting one. Will the deep state respond by essentially trying to use WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and Russiagate against him? That's why I think that it may well be that the Justice Department will bring up 2016 and WikiLeaks and Russiagate as an indictment. There'll be a superseding indictment bringing up the 2016 business. After all, they've got the basis for it with Mueller. I mean, you said yourself, Joe, Mueller is suggesting that Russia and Assange were in on it. However ambiguous his wording, there'll be a basis for it. Yeah, he tried to defraud the United States. He interfered in our election. So that could be the basis for a superseding indictment. And that's something, again, the deep state could hold over Trump.
Well, two things about that. Mueller, of course, never went to London to send anybody to interview Assange. He knew where he was. And two, why that doesn't involve Chelsea Manning. We read at the beginning that she's still.
I agree with that. That's a separate issue.
She cannot give any testimony about the 2016 election. Yeah. I think without the collusion finding, it would be very hard to bring that kind of a charge against Assange about the election. I really don't think they're going to go down that road. There's no collusion. Elizabeth, if you don't mind, maybe you do. Just don't do it. But you're one of the first, maybe the first to start reporting about some aspects of this QAnon group and what they're saying about that this is all a plot by Trump to get Assange to the U.S. so he could testify and all this rubbish. So I think this might be a good point to bring something in on that.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, the QAnon narrative has gone so far in one direction that it's come back around and is merging with the claims made by Russiagate proponents. So I think it's very, very, disturbing. But I honestly see QAnon as basically a mirror, an inverted mirror image of Russiagate in a lot of ways. Both of them basically allege that Trump is going to, basically bring Assange to the United States to then protect him somehow. And that is so ridiculous. It's just, I don't even know where to begin with that. But basically, recently what I did was I just wrote a very off-the-cuff, opinion piece on the way that QAnon operates as far as the manipulative tactics that are used by QAnon. The QAnon narrative uses very subjective, vague statements thrown in with maybe one fact or two. And what a person has to do when they're looking at that is they then have to make their own interpretation of it in order to make any sense of it. And so then when you basically, if they then believe that to be somehow factual information, when you basically, talk to them about it and question their conclusions, they end up responding to you like a cult member. It's like you're confronting a very core sense of self because they've interpreted their meaning from QAnon based on their own perception of the situation. So basically, QAnon and Russiagate both turned into basically cult followings, I feel. And I think that the idea that Trump is going to protect Assange after the treatment that the UK has been showing him is absolutely absurd. If Trump wanted to, protect Assange and get testimony from him, he could have preemptively pardoned him, given him full immunity, and then offered to have a video link or some sort of testimony in that fashion. That hasn't happened. It's not what's happening. And in addition to that, you have the treatment of Chelsea Manning, right now being kept in prison simply to coerce her to cooperate with a grand jury that is impaneled to prosecute Assange. You have the judge fining her for her refusal to cooperate in addition to being imprisoning her. So I feel that this is really, that's the clearest way that I can debunk both the claims of both Russiagate proponents and QAnon followers who believe that this is somehow a 5D chess move by Trump to bring Assange over and testify. And just to debunk their claims a little bit further, you also have them say, oh, well, we need Assange to come to the US so that he can testify, and that and they believe that it's going to be some sort of typical trial situation. And we've had John Kiriakou come onto this Vigil so many times and talk about his experience in the way that is absolutely ridiculous. That's not the way it would happen. It would be completely closed. National security would be invoked. Assange's own lawyers would not be able to access the material used against him. It would not be a fair, open, public trial process. So there are many, many ways you can factually counter QAnon claims. But basically, when you do that, what I've noticed is when you engage with these people who follow that, they end up just going in a loop of logical fallacies. They reinforce their own confirmation bias, and it's pretty much useless. So I doubt that if there are any QAnon followers listening, that they'll really take much interest in what we have to say about it. But that's the situation as I see it.
You mean Unity4J is not in league with the QAnon? Oh, that's
not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, you mentioned curiosity. We're hoping that John's going to join us. He told me he would. I taped his program this morning with Brian Becker, and that's probably being broadcast right now while we're doing this. And I asked John about when he was in prison, what kind of doctors are there in prison? Because I'm curious whether doctors follow the Hippocratic Oath in the prison. They may want to. I wonder if the authorities in the prison, warden or whatever, couldn't tell the doctor, don't treat this prisoner the same way you would someone on the outside. And what he told me was shocking. He said that the doctors in prisons are absolutely amongst worst in society, that these are doctors who can't really get work anywhere else. And he cited one doctor who had been fired from the Cleveland Clinic because he was a pediatrician and too many of his children were dying. So he wound up getting a job in the prison where John was imprisoned.
Wow.
This, of course, I asked that in the context of what kind of treatment Julian might be getting right now. In the prison hospital, the medical ward of Belmarsh is still in there. You have to wonder. But, that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning when George was saying that they wouldn't want to lose him because that would be a public relations disaster. So if that's the case, if George is right, and I hope he is, then he'll be getting good care if they don't want to lose him.
I hope so, but I do think that is an important point in that we want to re-emphasize that in case some people have misinterpreted the news about about Assange being in the health ward, that this is not an outside hospital. He hasn't been, as you say, he has not been taken to a conventional, medical clinic or anything like that. It's within the prison, and as you say, that is, notoriously insufficient. And from what I understand, that type of situation is not equipped for serious medical intervention. I don't know the specifics of Belmarsh, but in general, I don't think that prison health wards have that type of care available.
We also have to keep in mind that let's remember that John Pilger has said many times that who he's visited in the embassy and in Belmarsh as well, that he's had a persistent cough for 7 years. And if you recall, his doctors recommended and said urgently he needed to go out of the embassy to get tests, MRIs, X-rays, whatever, because his health condition, we don't know the details. And the British government said, sure, if you leave, you're going to get arrested. So effectively, they were telling him, you cannot go out to get medical treatment. So that's part of, I would imagine, in the rapporteur's report, it was probably going to be mentioned that they prevented him, in effect, from getting medical treatment. He was in the prison, and they were supposed to give him medical treatment right away, they made statements. And his conditions become so bad that they had to hospitalize him inside the prison. And not, as you read, Elizabeth, you cannot have a conversation with his Swedish lawyer about his defense in the Swedish case. I mean, it's, I'm trying to be optimistic here, and I am optimistic, and I think I disagree with George on this too, about the fact that the media has gone in against Trump, not so much in favor of Assange, but against this indictment. And I think that this report from the rapporteur today further complicates the extradition case and his health further complicates that. So I'm optimistic on that score. I'm not optimistic about the treatment he's getting.
Yeah. Well, I don't agree with you, Joe, because we've had these things before. I mean, we had the UN working group on detention that they came up with that report. Twice they said that he had been arbitrarily detained. They demanded the British government release him. It got a lot of publicity, and this was even at the time when Julian had means of addressing the media, and he didn't do very much in terms of the publicity. I mean, I think that these people, like Rachel Maddow, the New York Times editorial board, the Washington Post editorial board, they want to nail Assange. I mean, they want him in prison for life. I mean, there's no other ways to go. They want him in prison for life. What they don't like is the Trump administration going after him using the Espionage Act. They don't like that. In the first place, and Maddow was very explicit about it, she was afraid that the British government or the British courts would reject it. That's what she was concerned about. She wasn't concerned that, the press is, the freedom of the press is in danger. She was concerned that the Trump administration is deliberately sabotaging the attempt to get Julian Assange over here by putting forward something that the British courts are bound to reject. That was also pretty much, the New York Times editorial and the Washington Post editorial were kind of, they didn't quite go as explicitly as Maddow, but that's what they didn't like about it. They were very happy with that initial indictment, not because they thought, oh, he'll only get 5 years, but they thought, hey, we're going to bring him over here, and then we're going to absolutely nail him. We're going to torture him until he tells us what we want to know about his connections with Russia. So these are not people who are, in Julian Assange's camp. They're not in the camp of the free press and the free media and whatever. They want to nail Assange. They want him locked away for life. They just don't like using the Espionage Act to get there. So these are not allies.
I agree with that. I don't think that they're allied with him, and I don't think they're in his camp. I think it's purely their self-interest. But it is their self-interest to oppose this indictment, and this indictment is now on the books. They have revealed it. So they're opposing the prosecution of Julian Assange under the Espionage Act. That's significant, and that helps create public opinion against this very controversial indictment. And which, by the way, holds lots of pages in there, or a lot of paragraphs are about the fact that Julian revealed the names of informants and put them in danger. And that, therefore, according to John Demers at the Department of Justice, makes him not a journalist. And in fact, it's not against the law to reveal the names of informants, and no evidence any informant was ever harmed. So that's just also a PR move by the DOJ in their indictment, in my opinion, to drum up support for this indictment, which is controversial. And I don't think that went.
I agree. But that actually worked, because the New York Times and the Washington Post and Marsha Gessen and any number of other journalists said exactly that. They repeated that very point that Demers said. He is not a real journalist. They actually said that. He's not a real journalist because he disclosed the names of sources. Actually, he's not like us. He's not, he doesn't respect his sources. He exposed them. So they echoed this very point. So, these aren't people who are going to go over to the barricades to defend Julian.
Is he unlike journalists like David Lee and Luke Harding, who actually are the ones who revealed?
I agree with you. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I absolutely agree with you.
That password led to an encrypted file with the names in them that only intelligence agencies would be able to decrypt and then find out who these people are without those people knowing, and then they'd be in trouble. And that forced WikiLeaks to then name these people in a report, which they did not intend to do. They had to rush it out with the names in there with the hopes that the people would see it and then run to safety before they can be gotten. But they weren't gotten anyway. That's clearly the point. But you're right, they did bring that out. But I still think that the fact that this criminalizes journalism and that things they do is what put them not necessarily in Assange's camp or for Assange, but against what Trump administration is doing here, what the DOJ is doing. And that is significant because people like Maddow and all that, they have enormous sway. And this is a political prosecution, which, by the way, is another reason why Britain may not be able to extradite him, because the treaties excludes anybody sent for political reasons to the United States. On top of that, there's his health. And now there's the fact that he has been psychologically tortured. This is going to, I hope, bring enormous public pressure on the UK authorities and the Swedish. It's interesting that Niles Meltzer also mentioned Sweden as one of the 4 countries that he blasted in this report, that they will not extradite him. That's our best hope here, that he could serve his 50 weeks and get out, hopefully, with his health restored. Now you're smiling, George.
Because I think it's just totally unrealistic. The one part of what you said that I do think is realistic, but I don't think it's going to be significant, is that the European Court of Human Rights will probably rule in his favor. But since the British courts are not bound by the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, particularly by then Britain will already have been out of the EU, it's not going to matter very much. The British courts generally look on very unfavorably on journalists revealing classified secrets. They're not at all sympathetic to that. Britain is not a First Amendment country. And they think it will probably look on with some sympathy with the US wanting to get their hands on a grubby, smelly individual who's revealing classified information. I don't think they're going to be rushing out and saying, my God, this is a political matter. They're going to look at it and say, yeah, we don't like these people who go around revealing classified secrets.
Well, God forbid that, Unity4J have some dissenting opinions and not have, one narrative, as we're sometimes accused of sort of putting forward. But Sam, I don't know, where do you fall on this kind of minor conflict between Joe and George's outlook on what's coming in the future?
I'd like to address that, but I'd like to clarify a couple of things that were said. George, did I hear you say that Assange was accused of not being a real journalist because he revealed his sources? He never revealed his sources. He revealed, secrets that, allegedly.
No, he revealed sources. They said that, real journalists would keep sources anonymous. He didn't do that.
What source did
the sources that were mentioned in the documents? The sources mentioned in the documents. The sources that the U.S. government uses. Not his sources, but the sources the U.S. government uses. Yeah, that's right. In other words, he didn't black out those names.
Yeah. So by that you mean like possible informants of the U.S. government.
That's what the New York Times editorials said, exactly that. The Washington Post editorial, Masha Gessen said all that. Yeah.
Okay, I think people might understand you to say that he revealed his sources. That is,
no, not his sources. No, U.S. government sources
that disclosed information to WikiLeaks. I want to clarify that. Regarding the what I guess we're calling the liberal position that is now, from my point of view, posturing as helping Assange, it rather reminds me of after they facilitated this demonization of Assange, that they now sort of want to wash their hands of it. It's a Pontius Pilate kind of move. I mean, it reminds me of people like Pelosi, who did a great deal to facilitate the invasion of Iraq, and including saying that Saddam Hussein clearly has weapons of mass destruction, blah 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 blah, and then voted against the authorization of the war after it was clear that Bush would get his authorization of the war. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to what Joe is saying, that it may at least be significant that the New York Times and others are now posturing as being against this incredibly unprecedented move of using the Espionage Act against the publisher and so on. But I don't mean to drag us into a Dostoevsky novel, but they've sort of brought us to this stage, and now they want to they want to lay it all on Trump's feet, given the incredible damage that this is going to do to the U.S. Bill of Rights and so on. So I look at that. I look at their current stance with a great deal of skepticism, at least.
What do you think, Elizabeth?
Well, I guess I fall somewhere in the middle. I'm a person who hopes for the best but plans for the worst. So I think all of these options. I mean, there's probably no good coming from the any potential outcome. But I think I doubt that the absolute best could happen. I doubt that he'll be free after 50 weeks or so and just be able to be healthy and go live a normal life. I think that is very unlikely, but I can hope for it. I think we have to act as if the worst is the most likely outcome, because that's, as activists who care about what happens to Assange and what happens to the freedom of the press, we have to plan for the worst. So that's kind of where I fall on this particular issue. But I just wanted to return to the QAnon subject very, very briefly to say, to add that it's interesting because Susie Dawson, the co-founder of Unity4J, was one of the very first people to go on a rampage debunking QAnon way back in early 2018 when it was only about 6 months old. So that I just wanted to add that, and also say that the QAnon narrative has gone so far in one direction, it has literally come around the other side, in the sense that I heard from a friend earlier today that one QAnon YouTube channel was saying that basically, that Mueller has been working for Trump, and that they want the House to impeach because it's quote unquote all part of the plan. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. So I just wanted to explain and add the level to which this narrative has just pretzeled so many people's minds. It's insidious and it's concerning for sure.
Well, is that QAnon YouTube channel, are they journalists?
No, not at all.
Oh, well, I thought that anybody who has a YouTube channel or a blog is a journalist these days.
I guess. I mean, I guess it depends on what your definition of journalist is versus propagandist, but that would be my differentiation.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about that, the definition of journalism. It's central to this whole argument. And it's in the DOJ's indictment. They're saying he's not a journalist. Why? Who? First of all, I think we would all agree the government should not be in the position to define who a journalist is or not. But after that, there might be some disagreement. And again, with George, I believe, because and Glenn Greenwald, too. I mean, yes, it's true. There's no licensing of a journalist as there is a doctor or a lawyer. However, in the United Kingdom, I don't know if this is still the case because I go back a few years, but I know that my colleagues from the British press all had to absolutely learn shorthand before you can get a job as some cub reporter, regional newspaper in the Midlands or something. You had to know shorthand. There were other requirements. I don't know if it was an official license, but you had to learn a few things to become a journalist. And in my opinion, you have to know how to evaluate evidence, whether it's true or not. You have to be able to write it or present it in an audio or video format in a way that's understandable to people. You have to make huge decisions about what is newsworthy and what is not, what to leave in, what to leave out, understanding what sourcing is all about, understanding libel and copyright law, understand again how to structure a story and how to get the other side of the story or multiple sides of the story. There's a lot that goes into it, and frankly, I'll be very personally, I've been making my living as a journalist for about 4 decades now, and I'm somewhat insulted when I know how hard I've worked, and then somebody just put a YouTube channel like George Webb, and I think Elizabeth can get into that a little bit. George Webb has a YouTube thing. He has over 100. I'm not that I'm jealous of his following. I'm a little alarmed by it. 100,000 or more people. And the guy before that hearing in Leonie Brinkerman's courtroom, number 700 at the Alexandria Courthouse, that I was there in person when that Reporters Committee for Freedom wanted to unseal the indictment last fall. He had said on YouTube that Assange was going to be in that courtroom, that he's not in the Ecuadorian embassy. The Americans had already kidnapped him out of there, and he was going to show up. And of course, after that hearing, guess who I see sitting in this restaurant across the street from the courthouse? But George Webb, with about 4 or 5 acolytes around him. And I was almost about to go up to say, hey, George, you see Julian in there? Do you see him in there? No. So, I mean, this guy is so full of it, but he has such a big following. And of course, he thinks he's a journalist, and a lot of people, like 100,000, think that he is too. So I think it's dangerous to go down that road. And anybody with a microphone or a computer terminal is automatically a journalist. You have to know what information you're giving out. You have a responsibility to ensure that what you're saying is accurate and that you could back it up with evidence. And that takes some experience. No, it's not rocket science. But if I said tomorrow I'm a rocket scientist, I think rocket scientists would be very upset. So the way I am when everybody and their uncle is saying, oh, I'm a journalist too. Okay, I've said my piece. Go ahead, George.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that it isn't the same as rocket science. I mean, rocket science, usually you kind of have to have a couple of degrees, probably a PhD as well into the bargain, before you can call yourself a rocket scientist. I just don't think that about journalists. Now, what you said is right. I mean, there was a time in Britain when the journalist profession was controlled by the National Union of Journalists, and you could not get a job on a national newspaper, what used to be called the Fleet Street newspaper, before you had done 3 years in the provinces and you had learned all the things that you had just said. Learned shorthand, learned how to write stories about flower shows and lost kitten and all that. You had to learn all that, then you got a job on a national newspaper. But that kind of ended in the mid-1980s when Rupert Murdoch basically destroyed the power of the trade unions of journalists. And pretty much anybody could get a job on a national newspaper, provided you had the connections. I mean, the union just was no longer in a position to control who got hired. And then, of course, with the whole revolution in technology, with the internet and so on, I would think that, there's no point in holding on to that, romantic idea of what a journalist meant circa 1965. I mean, that was, probably then at that time, you could say that's what a journalist is. He's somebody who knows how to put together a story. He knows how to get the sources. He knows how to get both sides of a story. He knows how to put it together, and bring it in at under 600 words or whatever. That required skill, no question. But that world is gone. And I think we have to live with the situation that, journalists now, people who write blogs, people who tweet, people who have YouTube channels, they are all journalists. And, and I think that's the reality today.
I feel like...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think for me, the way that I would differentiate between journalism and not journalism is not through experience so much as defining a journalist as someone, whether they're experienced or not, who is adversarial to power structures, and somebody who is a propagandist is someone who props up those power structures. And propagandists exist both in the legacy press, cable news, corporate media framework, and they also exist and flourish, unfortunately, even more than they do on the establishment side of things, in the alternative press and on alternative platforms. So to me, that's how I differentiate them. Whether they're somebody like George Webb or Rachel Maddow, I think that there is a very distinct difference between journalists and propagandists. But unfortunately, I think the propagandists within the alternative media are thriving much, much more than the ones that write for the Washington Post or something like that.
Well, I think I totally agree with that. Being in an adversary relationship with government or whoever you're covering is absolutely necessary. You can't be chummy with them. And one of the WikiLeaks releases, of course, from the DNC, we saw that members, New York Times reporters, were giving their copy to the campaign to approve before they gave it to their editors. That would be a fireable offense in my day. And speaking of my day, George, if you go to consortiumnews.com, you'll see at the very top, our banner, there's something below that I understand people under 30, and I'm going to include you, Elizabeth, I don't know what that is. I've had a young person say, did that have something to do with a typewriter? There is a typewriter ribbon there. And our logo is written in what's called American Typewriter. That's the name of the font. And it's established in 1995. And I can tell you, Bob Perry was a guy from those days. And what I'm trying to do by continuing his legacy at Consortium News is to keep those old days that you say are gone, George, and you may be right. I'm holding on to that and trying to keep those standards in the reporting and analysis that we do, and not just to become another online alternative publication, of which there are many good ones out there. I'm not casting any aspersions, but we're trying to do something different by applying those old skills that you said that used to be necessary. I'm requiring that of my writers, not that all those writers are happy with me when I do that, by the way. But we have editors who are insisting that we do it that way. You're frowning, George. So what do you got to say now to that?
Well, because I think that what you're saying, your goals are noble, and I support that. But unfortunately, the use of journalism as somehow a club that only certain people belong to and others don't, is being used by politically motivated characters to disqualify views and writers and opinions that they don't like. So when the New York Times says Julian Assange is not a journalist, that same New York Times is going to say, well, RT is not really a news outlet. And something else, Al Jazeera, not really a news outlet. It's a way of disqualifying views and writers and opinions and positions that you don't like. And so that's why I'm not very happy about when you start restricting who is and who's not a journalist, that it's going to be used by others to disqualify a whole range of views that they don't like. And you've seen what's happened to RT, which is actually, of course, it's a journalistic outlet. You may not like what appears on RT, but if it's a journalistic outlet, yet as far as the much of the Western media is concerned, also, well, RT is not really a journalistic outlet. It's just a propaganda platform for the Russian government. So once you start this kind of game of who is and who's not a journalist, you're going to find an awful lot of people are quickly eliminated from this club.
That's a very good point. RT is a journalistic outfit. What you're getting is the Russian point of view on the news, just the way you get the British point of view from the BBC and the American point of view from CNN and the New York Times. Of course, American reporters, and I worked amongst many of them, think they have universal values, and it's not the American point of view. They don't understand that they've got a kind of Orientalist view of the world, that they interpret what Eastern peoples like Russians and Iranians and Arabs, and Palestinians, what they think that those people are saying and doing, rather than reporting exactly directly what those people are saying, to connect the American reader with the people on the ground in the Palestinian areas, for example, or with average Russians. They might get along with one another, and that makes going to war harder, by the way. If you start presenting people that the American government thinks are enemies as human, if you start presenting them as humans, like Americans are, that screws things up. So I think that's true. But I wanted to point out that mainstream media, obviously, if you read Concerned News, you know anything about me, I'm a stronger critic of what they do than anyone. I think that by omission, they leave out so much, and that's how they shape the news to the point of almost sometimes being like propaganda, particularly when leading up to a war like the war in Iraq, and hopefully not here in Iran. But the production values of the mainstream media are much better than the largely amateurish alternative media, which could have a much better political point of view than the mainstream media, which is a horrible political agenda, which is essentially the state's agenda, the government's agenda. This is a disaster. So by consorting, what we're trying to do is to combine both. The best of both worlds, the production values, the skills, the rigorous fact-checking, the way reporting should be done. That's what Bob Perry did. Combine that with the better political point of view of the alternative media and kick out the mainstream media's political viewpoints, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Keep the good reporting going. But you cannot have anybody. I understand what you're saying about a club. It's a very wide open thing. Anybody can get in there who can prove they could do the job, basically. We know how to evaluate evidence. Is it true or not? That's really, for me, the final arbiter of whether someone can perform journalism or not, is whether they understand what's true, what isn't, and what is factual and what isn't, and that they back it up with evidence. They back up what they say with evidence. And let me just underscore all of this by saying I absolutely, after 40 years in corporate media and now as editor-in-chief of Concerned News, completely believe that, say that Julian Assange is a journalist as well as a publisher. You'll just look at what the indictment says. They're describing him doing journalism. That's the best definition you could have. He's encouraging his sources to give information. He's trying to protect their identity. Bob Perry, the founder of Conservative News, wrote in 2010, November, a month after we learned the Obama administration began their investigation to Assange that led to this indictment ultimately on Thursday, said that he encouraged his sources to break the law if necessary, to give him classified information that would expose a much larger crime. There's no better definition of what WikiLeaks has done. Yes, and he encouraged Assange, Manning to give more, although Manning has testified that was her decision alone to do this. And she went first to the New York Times and the Post, and they turned it down. But as Bob says, you should encourage your sources to give you more, even break the law, to expose a bigger crime being war crime in Iraq, for example. So that's my last word on this subject.
Yeah, but I don't actually think that the production values of the mainstream media are necessarily that great. If you're judging production values by factual accuracy, I mean, if we just go by factual accuracy, just look at the dud stories that the Washington Post, the mighty Washington Post, has run. I mean, we had the prop or not nonsense. We had the Vermont grid, that the Russians had broken into the national grid via Vermont utility. We had nonsense about the emails. The Michael Cohen was having discussions with Dmitry Peskov about building a Trump Tower in Moscow. You can go on and on, and we can talk about CNN and all of their dud stories, ABC News. So these institutions were really in no position to start turning their nose up at WikiLeaks. And after it's not that long ago when we had the New Republic, another one that's sort of journalism that was just basically were taken in for a couple of years by the character Stephen Glass. I mean, this went on for about 2 years. They were taking it by such a transparent fraud. So you know, I just don't think the mainstream media are in any position to start saying, well, I think he's not really one of us because we do all this rigorous fact checking. And we don't, well, where was this fact checking? You know, I mean, when they reported that, you know, we know that Donald Trump had told Michael Cohen to lie to Congress. You know, they ran with that story before they even the first kind of fact checking. So what I'm just saying is that I don't think these production values of the mainstream media are necessarily that impressive. You then you have to aspire towards that. So
I agree with that. There was Jason Blair at the New York Times who got fired for making up sources and making up names. But that's why we have a typewriter ribbon on there, because we're hearkening back to a day when I think the values were better, never perfect. The media, I don't want to idealize that era of the 1970s, but the president was brought. Cy Hirsch did a story that helped bring about and Sam knows a lot about this, the Church Committee report that uncovered so many crimes by the intelligence agencies. There was a more vibrant media that was critical in those days. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We've lost that. And you're right, the values, the production values, as I call them, are absolutely horrendous right now at the New York Times. All those mistakes that you just cited were good examples during the whole Russiagate fiasco, that they reported completely erroneous things because they were so driven to try to prove this story, they didn't check out simple facts, like was that Vermont grid really shut down by the Russians or not? I mean, that is horrendous. These people should be fired, all of them. These are rookie mistakes that were being made at high levels because they were overcome by a political agenda. That's not what you're supposed to have in the media. You know, a distinct political agenda, except to stand up for democratic values and against corruption and war crime. That's the kind of agenda you're supposed to have, no matter which party's doing it, because they both do it, as we know.
Right. No, I agree.
think that really is one of the reasons that Consortium News is unique, though, is the combination of the adversarial status to, attitude to power, but also the fact that you do have that experience and long track record of amazing investigative reporting. And I'm not saying that just as a plug. I'm saying that is very, very rare. It's not something that any other online outlet can really, claim or have that background behind them, attesting to their history. So I think that, if we use that type of definition for journalism, I think very few can live up to that. But I'll reference a comment that I was just seeing in the YouTube chat from a Bangladesh journalist for the Daily Star, who said that really it's all about bringing truth to the public. That's it. And that's what Julian Assange cared about. So maybe that should be the definition for journalism. And again, that comment came from a journalist as well. So I thought I would share it. So Sam, I don't know where you fall on that paradigm about what is and what is not a journalist.
Yeah, well, I think that we're seeing the problems and the biases on a day in, day out basis, whether it's the recent OPCW document regarding Syria that's gotten virtually no play in the establishment press in the United States, the horrendous coverage of Venezuela, incredibly biased, incredibly building up an agenda of demonizing the Maduro government and so on. So these, to me, do not, quite, get into the level of, Iraq war propaganda, but they don't need to. They're not building up, a public consensus for a total invasion and what's required for that. They're just simply keeping U.S. militarism at a steady simmer, at least. I interpreted the production values remark somewhat differently, and I view the rise of Al Jazeera not too long after the Iraq invasion. First the rise of Al Jazeera, and then the rise of Al Jazeera English, and then Al Jazeera America, and then after Al Jazeera turned and became, from somewhat useful to incredibly problematic after the Arab uprisings in 2011, where they basically did the bidding of the Gulf states, you saw the rise of RT. And both Al Jazeera and RT, in terms of presentation and video quality and graphics and having, correspondence in different parts of the world, have strong production values. But they are wedded, certainly at some level, to an orientation that's aligned with a government. And at one level, in terms of RT, that's a breath of fresh air because there's some distinction between the US government and the Russian government. But at another level, it has sort of supplanted the possibility of a meaningful, grassroots supported and, to use Joe's term, professional, old schooly real journalism that does aspire to universal values. Pacifica could have conceivably played that role in the United States, but it is filled with so many contradictions and fighting, and we can get into Democracy Now! If you want to, and the issues around that. And I think to some extent, WikiLeaks could have filled that role. When WikiLeaks was, reaching the public in an unprecedented way, what's the first thing that Congress did, led by Joe Lieberman? Pull the plug on them, make sure they don't get funding, make sure that people who are hearing about WikiLeaks for the first time and getting a breath of, factual news about the realities of U.S. war, pull the plug on them, make sure that regular people can't use their credit cards to give them money. So WikiLeaks has been, on the defensive for all of these years, with their publisher, now literally potentially fighting for his very life, instead of spawning a truly independent global news enterprise that is dedicated to genuinely informing the public. And certainly you have Consortium News, attempting to do that, but there's an obvious limitation of resources. And how do you reach that broader public? The only ways to do it are to have cash, and you have the example of the Intercept, or to have documents that are unavoidable for the rest of the media to pay attention to. And WikiLeaks had that, and to some extent, the Intercept with the Snowden documents had that. But it, in ways somewhat similar to Democracy Now!, in my view, has been limited in various respects, and shies away from critiquing U.S. foreign policy at a certain level. So, to me, journalism is about accuracy and fearlessness. If you're afraid of something or somebody and you're not reporting on them, whether that's Al Jazeera towing the line for Qatar, or RT vis-a-vis the Russian government, or I think virtually any U.S. station in terms of, U.S. stations rely on FCC licenses. Why aren't they labeled as dependent on the U.S. government? If the U.S. government wanted to fold up virtually any electronic media, they could. When Watergate was breaking, there was a great line from one of Nixon's henchmen, I think Mitchell, Kathy Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, is going to get her titties in a ringer. What did he mean by that? He meant that Nixon would, if they continued going after Watergate, would go after the FCC licenses that the Washington Post had. The Washington Post wasn't just a newspaper; it controlled radio stations and TV stations and so on. So, and I don't think that journalism is necessarily just about being oppositional to government. I agree with virtually everything that Joe said, but I mean, take the situation in Venezuela today. The U.S. establishment recognizes as genuine journalists only journalists who are anti-Maduro. So it's towing a line. If by some miracle you had, Bernie Sanders and he pursued an actual decent U.S. foreign policy, or by some miracle Mike Gravel as president of the United States, the establishment media, I think, would be vociferous in their attacks on such a president. The CNN's attacks on Trump would be nothing compared to what we would see in a situation. And it's not just a left-right thing. If Ron Paul became president, or Dennis Kucinich became president and did anything like what they say they generally want to do in terms of U.S. foreign policy, the establishment, the corporate media attack on them would be monumental. So I think journalism is, at a deep sense, and I don't know how far back it goes historically, has been, totally betrayed, and people are hungry for something else. And part of, the machinations of a story like Russiagate, and it becomes so complicated that normal people tune out. So that you forget, oh, why did they go after WikiLeaks? Oh yeah, they're the ones that showed that video, that collateral murder video of the reality of the Iraq War, that they tried to suppress for years. Let's remember the collateral murder video. What was that? That was an attack on journalism too. They were Reuters journalists in Iraq. They were Iraqis working for Reuters, trying to depict the realities of war. They got viciously, they were murdered. They were slaughtered by U.S. gunship. Reuters tried forever to try to get documentation or video. The U.S. government stalled. And ultimately that's what Chelsea Manning provided for Julian Assange. And I think why they ultimately hate him. He exposed their war crimes.
Sam, I think we have an example of what you were talking about already. What would they do if Kucinich had become president or somebody? What they're doing to Tulsi Gabbard now is just a primary candidate in the Democratic Party. They're completely destroying her because she's raising this issue of regime change, wars, etc. So we got that example again. I wanted to move this back, if we could, to that torture report and where we think that's going to lead. And we have Michael Coggins on with us right now. If you can unmute yourself. And I saw Peter B. Collins was there for a second. Oh, here he is.
It's actually,
yeah.
It's Oscar Grenfell with us. He's just using Michael's account, I believe. Welcome to you, and also to Peter B. Collins.
Yeah, I was expecting Oscar. So Oscar and Peter, we began this by talking about the torture report, the report by the UN Special Rapporteur on torture, and we read extensively from it. I'm assuming both of you are familiar with what was said. Very, very strong language condemning the U.S., Britain, Ecuador, and Sweden for ganging up on Julian Assange in a way that he had never seen in 20 years of reporting on that. I just want to read one quote, and then I'd like to kick off the discussion with the question of what impact will this have on Assange on the extradition hearing. That's because that's where we're at right now. He said, Niles Meltzer, in 20 years of work with victims of war, violence, and political persecution, I have never seen a group of democratic states ganging up to deliberately isolate, demonize, and abuse a single individual for such a long time and with so little regard for human dignity and the rule of law. Oscar and Peter, weigh in, please. Whoever speaks first has the floor.
Well, I think this is a really damning indictment of the criminality of all of those forces that have been involved in the persecution of Assange for the past 8 years. I mean, in their pursuit of Assange, the British, US, Ecuadorian, and Swedish governments have clearly violated his human rights, his legal rights, and this report is just the latest and I think most striking confirmation of that. I think, it's important to stress that Meltzer pointed to the collective mobbing that Assange has been subjected to. That's not only the governments that have been involved, but I think, as you've been discussing, the corporate press. I mean, for the past 8 years, no lie has been too great, no slander too base to be hurled against Assange. I mean, what we've seen is really the collapse of any democratic pretense, especially within the liberal media. I mean, outlets such as the New York Times, The Guardian, which have just functioned openly as the adjuncts of the state campaign against Assange. I mean, they're the mouthpieces of governments, the intelligence agencies, in the trampling of democratic rights. And I think they're clearly responsible for the psychological torture that Julian Assange has suffered. I think the quote that you just read about Meltzer not having seen anything of this nature in the past 20 years is significant. I mean, it demonstrates that the Assange case is an historic turning point. I mean, I think in their pursuit of the WikiLeaks founder, the governments involved are reviving the methods of political persecution associated with the gangster regimes of the 20th century, including, frankly, the fascists. And I think that can only be understood in a broader political context. I mean, we are living through the deepest crisis of capitalism since the 1930s, an explosion of militarism and war, and I think very significantly, the re-emergence of mass social and political opposition from below. Governments are very aware that there's enormous hostility to the agenda that they're imposing of war, austerity, and I think they're seeking to make an example of Assange, of Chelsea Manning, that this is what happens to people who challenge the state. So I think that the report really, from our standpoint as defenders of Julian Assange, of democratic rights, underscores the urgency of transforming the mass support for Assange that exists among ordinary people into a political movement to secure his freedom, in the struggle against war, in defense of all democratic rights. So I'll just make those points.
Well said, Oscar. And I would say that from the American perspective, this goes back to 1947 and the National Security Act, the creation of the CIA, and the elements of our intelligence community today. And the covert operations that required secrecy have been compounded over the years. And, we have to, now that I want to credit him, I'm trying to think of his name, the professor who coined the term blowback, taught at UC Berkeley and then retired at
Charles Johnson.
Thank you, George. You can be our collective memory. But Chalmers Johnson coined that phrase about blowback, and so we have these waves of anti-democratic actions that are kept secret. Then the reaction to those actions, blowback, requires further action, and we just keep descending into deeper and deeper layers of secrecy. And that's where, I can give full-throated support to WikiLeaks and the work of Julian Assange. They have attempted to dismantle, piece by piece, pardon me, the unnecessary secrecy that has been used to cover up financial crimes, war crimes, and embarrassing policy blunders. And so until we have some sort of a commitment to get to the root of that, to have a moment of truthiness where we reconcile and admit the bullshit that we have been embracing and promoting with the enthusiastic support of the corporate media, I think we're going to stay in this cycle for the foreseeable future.
Well,
Absolutely. Go ahead, Joe.
no, that was a downer, Peter. Nobody has a thing to say to you about that. Maybe George. Michael, chime in, please.
Well, I'll jump in very fast just to say that I think what's really unfortunate as well, to add on to what Peter is saying, is that what's rare and shocking about Niels's report is that it was so honest, and it's sad that that's such an unusual occurrence, both in regards to the reporting on Assange, but just in general. So I think that really is an indictment not only of the treatment of Assange, but the discussion around it that has been so biased and so partisan for a very long time.
Well, in defense of UN rapporteurs, they have a pretty good record. You know, Richard Falk, for example, was the UN rapporteur on the Middle East, on Palestine, Israel, and he got into a lot of trouble with the United States because he was so frank in his denunciation of Israeli practices. There have been rapporteurs who have condemned the death penalty in the U.S., poverty in the U.S., and of course that is never looked upon very well by the American establishment, particularly Republicans. They despise it. They will really. You can imagine John Bolton this morning when he was having his toast and coffee. He was spitting it out when he was reading about this torture report. I mean, this is the kind of thing he really hates. And that's why he was sent to the UN to kind of destroy that organization as best as he could, because they see the United Nations as like a fly in the ointment. They are, you know, with the General Assembly that still exists, any anti-American or at least anti-imperialist forces there, they're a barrier to what America wants to do around the world. And the best example is the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when even their own allies, Germany and France, on the Security Council, teamed with Russia and China to oppose that resolution, which they never got, which they invaded anyway, which is what John Bolton said in a 1994 conference. Doesn't matter what the UN says, we're going to do whatever we want anyway. And they put that into practice. But here's once in a while, someone will stand up in that organization and tell it like it is, and not unlike how WikiLeaks told it like it is, in a much more profound and widespread way. And that really gets the ire of the American establishment people.
Right. Well, it's very funny what you're saying, Joe, because all these attacks from U.S. politicians and media types against the UN, say, oh, it's UN is so biased against the United States, it's so biased against Israel, the UN this, UN that. But what they don't really accept is that represents the consensus of the international community. The international community basically thinks that Israel is basically behaving outrageously towards the Palestinians, that there's been the outline of a settlement has been possible since the early 1970s. I mean, everyone knows what the basic outline of the settlement should be, the two-state solution. And the US and Israel have basically sabotaged this for almost 50 years. So when they attack the UN, they're basically attacking the rest of the world. So in the same way, when they attack the UN, well, they didn't support what the United States planned to do in Iraq. The UN is so biased against us. Well, it's because you couldn't persuade even your closest allies, as you say, France and Germany, to go along with you. So you have 3 permanent Security Council members, France, Russia, China, all of whom were ready to veto any plan to invade Iraq. So your problem isn't with the UN, it's with the rest of the world. So that's why they hate the special rapporteur. Yeah, this is somebody who's speaking for the rest of the world, and he doesn't think much of it.
I remember Sam Power when she was ambassador. I had an exchange with her at the stakeout outside the Security Council when she was saying the UN is not operating the way it should because Russia's standing in our way. And I said, no, wait a minute. It's exactly the way it's supposed to operate. That you had conflicting interests and you try to work out something in common here. That it's not just who obeying the United States. And this is Samantha Power, Democrat, right? I'm not talking about Bolton here. Same thing. Same. I think the U.S. and the U.K. define who the international community is, George. You know that.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. And so, Russia and China, well, they're sort of the bad guys. Well, what proportion of the world's population do they represent? We can just discount them and we just focus on ourselves.
And some bad days, India is excluded too, so that's even more of the world's population.
That's it, exactly. Yeah. And on all the basic things that the U.S. really cares about, India does not go along with it. I mean, India did not go along with the Iraq invasion, didn't go along with Libya. So, yeah, that's another 1.5 billion people who are not part of the international community. They're missing from the international community.
Well, I think you're describing American exceptionalism. And we, for example, do not support the International Criminal Court because we fear that some of our criminals will wind up at the ICC. And likewise, we use the UN when it suits our purposes and ignore it or vilify it when it doesn't. And this has reached a new extreme under Trump but there's great continuity for this duality over the last 40, 50 years, I would say.
Well, let me throw this question out, Mike. Oscar, maybe if you could start by answering, what impact will this torture, this report by the rapporteur, have on the extradition process, if any? Will it make it harder to extradite him?
Well, I think, again, it is an exposure of the illegality of what these governments are carrying out. I think very striking in the report is just the statement that Assange is not being afforded due process in Britain. I mean, the fact that he was convicted within hours of being hauled out of the embassy building, I mean, that just doesn't happen in a normal legal case. The prejudicial comments of the presiding judge in that instance, denouncing Assange as a narcissist, I think it's going to make it more difficult potentially. But I think Jeremy Hunt's response on Twitter is very striking as well. I mean, he immediately said, don't interfere with our processes. Keep your inflammatory statements to yourself. Again, it just indicates that these governments are running roughshod over international law, and frankly over their own eviscerated, democratic protections. I think that the critical issue, though, for us is bringing what's been revealed in this report to the working class, to the broader population. I think what we've encountered since the arrest of Assange on April the 11th is a tremendous degree of shock, opposition to what's occurred among ordinary people, which finds no expression within the political or media establishment. So certainly the perspective of the World Socialist website, the Socialist Equality parties, is that to prevent Assange's extradition, to secure his freedom, is going to require a mass movement from below, a mass political movement of the working class. That's not going to be built in the press rooms of the New York Times, the Guardian, or in the corridors of power. It needs to come from us. It needs to come from ordinary people.
That is a great point. And one of the refrains we get in feedback from people that are watching the stream live and also just in general is the question, what can I do to help? What can we do to help? So if you have any thoughts on what the people watching and listening might be able to do to kind of, encourage that mass movement, I'm sure that our listeners would like to hear it. And I know that we're having some video problems seeing you at the moment, George, but if you have any thoughts on that, I think it would be great to share them. But same with you, Peter, what if you have any answer to that question we get over and over again, I'm sure that people would like to hear it, especially now in the wake of this report.
Yeah, George, you first.
You go ahead.
Well, I'm, I think like Joe said a couple of weeks ago, I'm not really an activist. I don't know that much about how to organize things. I mean, I am, my feeling is that you basically just do whatever is reasonable. I think, organize a small demonstration outside Belmarsh prison. Do that, every day if possible. Get somebody there all the time. Or, organize demonstrations outside courts, as there was when there was the hearing at the Westminster Court the other day, in the hope that gradually the crowds get larger, with each demonstration. But I'm sure, Oscar, you're much more cognizant of this kind of thing than I am.
Yeah, well, I think our party has held important events over the past period. Earlier this month, we held a meeting in Britain, attended by some 150 people, had speakers from the United States, Britain, Germany, also from the Julian Assange Defence Committee. It was an international event, very much stressing the need to mobilise the working class in defence of Assange. I think, what needs to be explained as broadly as possible is that the attacks on Assange are an attack on all of our democratic rights. Clearly, what's seeking to be established in the United States is the abolition of freedom of the press, the protections of the First Amendment. But I think we also have the assertion by the Trump administration of sort of principle of America first, you know, the extraterritorial application of US domestic law. You know, anyone who opposes what the US government is doing can face arrest, extradition, etc. So I think we need to explain that, you know, the attack on Assange is directed against all of our democratic rights. Certainly we need to hold meetings, protests. But I think the issue is one of political orientation. I mean, this report by Melzer is an indictment of the governments involved, the media, but I think also all of those organizations that have abandoned Julian Assange, from the trade unions to various pseudo-left parties that lined up behind the Swedish claims. I mean, the reason there are not mass demonstrations in Britain, for instance, you know, demanding Assange's freedom is because Corbyn and the British Labour Party are completely silent. If Corbyn issued a call for a mass demonstration, you know, outside Belmarsh prison or in the centre of London, you'd have hundreds of thousands of people in attendance. So I think, you know, we need to take our message out into the working class, but we also need to indict all of those political forces responsible for this situation, for the absence at this point of an organised mass movement in defence of Assange.
Well, I certainly agree that we need to inform, motivate, and organize the general public. It is truly challenging. It was, I guess, 4 weeks ago today, a group of protesters organized here in San Francisco, and I joined them for a march down Market Street, which is one of the main boulevards here. And we had about 75 people. They all understood the gravity of the situation. They're not swayed by the smears of Julian Assange. But as we tried to engage people on a Friday afternoon in rush hour, the reactions were a lot of indifference, you know, people who just don't care about anything and don't want to get involved. And then there was ignorance. There were plenty of people who said, "Who's Assange? What's WikiLeaks?" And that is a clear failure of the media in this country, including, you know, many aspects of the independent media who have failed to really, you know, take this issue front and center. And then there were the people who were hostile. They were aware of who Assange is. And I was carrying a little recorder trying to capture comments from people on the street. And those who were hostile, you know, clearly have some knowledge of him, but what they know are the smears, and they embrace the need for secrecy. They believe that the corporate media is doing the right thing to trade access in exchange for being able to leak approved secrets from approved leakers, while criminalizing the independent leakers whose motivation is not a political end or some sort of self-aggrandizement. It is actually trying to get at the truth. And so, you know, I don't minimize the task that we have. I do think that we need to use many different approaches, and I want to take a second here to plug Lee Camp. He wrote a piece published at Mint Press earlier this week, and he opened with the attention-getting line, "Julian Assange is a dick. It's important that you understand that." And then he goes on to list 18 ways that Julian Assange changed the world by being a dick. And yes, you know, it's provocative. It might offend a few people, but it does, I think, send the appropriate message that it doesn't matter what kind of person Julian Assange is, and that he is being used to distract us from the very important and effective work that he has done. And so I think that Lee Camp, of course, he is a tool of Russia. He has a program that airs on RT, and he will be marginalized in any mention that he might draw in mainstream media. But I think we need to recognize that most of the people we know have limited information about this and not much of a commitment to the fundamentals that we talk about here of a free press, of the right to know, and the clear violation of the public trust that occurs on a daily basis. So I think we have to start, with friends and family, but we also have to. Am I frozen?
It's frozen.
Oh.
Yeah.
It looks all right to me.
From here, it looks like I'm live.
Just checking. George, Oscar, is it all right to you? It looks fine
heard,
to me.
yeah, I didn't have any problems. I heard everything Peter said.
No problem then. Please continue.
Well, a week ago when I came on, my first comment was that Chelsea Manning should be released pronto. And I haven't seen even the public figures who spoke up for Chelsea during her first incarceration for contempt address this new injustice, which is compounded by the fact that the superseding indictments have been released and there's no obvious purpose for them to continue to hold Chelsea. And so there's a domestic human rights issue that should be addressed by the so-called progressives and liberals in our elective offices. And, they're too busy responding to Trump's tweets or, trying to raise money for a presidential campaign. And so, even a basic issue like the injustice being visited on Chelsea Manning doesn't get much attention, and it's hard to get traction on it.
Yeah,
I agree. I think it's really unfortunately true. Go ahead, George.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think the one way would be, and I think we talked about this before with Elizabeth, is to get on mainstream media. Now, the only voice on mainstream media who seems at all interested in anything unusual and challenging is Tucker Carlson on Fox News. I don't know whether Tucker Carlson would air anything on Julian or about Chelsea Manning. It might be worth inquiring. He's had John Kiriakou on several times. He's had Aaron Matty on, and he's had Michael Tracy on. He may well be open to doing something on Julian. That has an impact. He has a large following. He has a large audience. This is Fox News after all. I don't know how to approach him. I don't know what's the best way of getting to him. But I think that might be one way of getting more people aware of what's going on.
Well, I sure agree, George. I don't support this left pox on Fox where people say, I would never appear there. I know plenty of people who do go on there. They hold their own. They may be vilified after they go off camera, but that's the risk you take. And I believe that Aaron Matei's appearance with Carlson this week, where he addressed the vagaries of the Mueller report and pointed out that St. Bob used qualifying language in the assertions that Russia hacked the DNC and gave it to WikiLeaks. And Tucker Carlson was clearly, thrown off guard. He said, "What?" he said, "Mueller did that?" And so I think that Matei, who I have great respect for, he's been on my podcast many times. He's very measured, and he's even-handed in his tone, even as he delivers, very strong statements and information. So yeah, Tucker Carlson might be one window we could knock on.
Oscar, do you have any thoughts to reply on that point?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's important to recognize that there is immense popular support for Julian Assange that's found various expressions. Certainly there's a petition that was initiated in Australia last year demanding that the Australian government fulfill its obligations to Assange as an Australian citizen, a journalist, and secure his release, his return here. I believe in the week after Assange's arrest on April the 11th, that petition grew by 70,000 signatures. Certainly in our campaigns in working class areas, whether it's in Australia, Britain, the United States, we find there are broad layers of the population who view Assange as a hero, who's being persecuted for exposing war crimes, mass surveillance, global diplomatic conspiracies. So I think it's important to recognize that because it points towards our tasks, which I believe is to orient towards the working class, ordinary people, and to mobilize them in Assange's defense. I think just the broader context here is that over the past 18 months, we have seen something new in world politics, and that is the re-emergence of mass working class struggle. We've seen enormous strikes in the United States. Britain, earlier this year, there was a general strike in India involving some 70 million workers, perhaps the largest in human history. And I think this is creating fear and terror within the corridors of power. I mean, they see where this is going, that this social discontent and opposition is and will intensify. I mean, you now have a situation in the United States where Donald Trump, fascistic president, is routinely warning against socialism, declaring that America will never be a socialist country. I don't think he's fearful of Sanders and the Democratic Socialists of America. He knows they're part of the political establishment. What he's pointing to is the immense opposition that exists among workers and young people. They see the writing on the wall. They know that their system is in real danger, and they're responding with police state and authoritarian measures. And I think the persecution of Assange, the re-imprisonment of Chelsea Manning, is the sharpest expression of that. But I think over the coming months, what we can anticipate, politically prepare for, is the intensification of this emerging movement of the working class. Strikes, mass protests. And I think what we need to fight for is for the defense of Assange, the defense of democratic rights, to be inscribed on the banner of those struggles.
Yeah, could I ask Oscar, what's in terms of mainstream Australian politicians, is any of them really taking up the cause of Julian Assange? Has any prominent Australian political figure done this?
No, I mean, it's been quite extraordinary. Well, I think the first point is that successive Australian governments have refused to defend Assange. I mean, that began way back in 2010 when the Greens-backed Labor government basically denounced WikiLeaks as a criminal organisation, pledged to assist the US attempts to destroy it. But April the 11th, so, when Assange was arrested, was just hours before a federal election was called in this country. You had senior politicians from Labor and the Liberal National Coalition declared that they'd provide Assange with unspecified consular assistance, committing them to nothing. You also had others who had remained silent on Assange's persecution for years, including the Greens. The Journalists' Union issued statements saying that, it would be unfortunate if he were extradited to the United States. Since then, there's just been complete silence. No figure from the major political parties, from the official press, has really even condemned, the new charges that have been unveiled by the Trump administration. So I think here, as elsewhere, there's an enormous disconnect between the sentiments of ordinary people and what the political establishment is carrying out. And just the last point I'd make is that the support of the Australian parties, the press, for the attacks against Assange is inextricably tied to their alignment with the United States. I mean, they're knee-deep in the preparations for conflict with China, and of course they're carrying out their own attacks on democratic rights. We've had new anti-encryption laws passed here recently with bipartisan support, moves towards the censorship of the internet. So I think there's certainly no indication that any of the Australian political establishment is backing Assange.
I just got a tweet here with news from Chelsea Manning. Her attorneys filed a brief with the court today. Anthony Tringa is the judge who has jailed her this time. And in the contempt hearing on May 16th, he ordered her jailed with the fine scheduled to start 30 days later. And he also asked her to reflect on her principles and objections to the grand jury process. So she responded today, partly to address the judge's request, and has made 5 arguments. 1, a renewal of the motion for release on the basis that she cannot be coerced and that her incarceration is therefore only punitive, and that is a violation of the Fifth Amendment. The government has now successfully obtained not 1 but 2 indictments without the benefit of or need for Chelsea's testimony. And as the government's 60-day window to add further charges prior to submission of their extradition request to Britain is almost over, the legitimacy of its purported need for Chelsea's evidence is increasingly doubtful. Point 3, the court may impose civil fines in order to coerce compliance with a court order, but not to punish disobedience with a court order. Coercive fines, however, are usually only applied to corporations which cannot be jailed. Furthermore, such fines may not be imposed without the court confirming that they will not be excessive or punitive. This requires the judge to carefully examine the witness's financial capacity. The 4th item here is, in the unusual event that fines are imposed on individuals, it is where the underlying contempt involves a refusal to comply with a court order about the management of large sums of money. There are no such facts in this case, and her lawyers believe that imposing any fine may be presumed to be definitionally punitive. And finally, although both fines and confinement are within the traditional contempt powers of the court, past cases suggest that these may be used one at a time or one after the other, but a court should not impose both at once. Now, these certainly are strong arguments from my perspective, but this judge has not been sympathetic, clearly, in the prior hearing. And as John Kiriakou has pointed out, that Eastern District of Virginia is quite problematic for national security cases seeking a fair hearing and a fair outcome.
No doubt about it, Peter. I don't know why they're keeping Chelsea if they had the superseding indictment already. I just wanted to bring in, of course, the great whistleblower, Daniel Ellsberg, joining us from Northern California, the Bay Area, where Peter also is. Daniel, thank you for joining us. I'd love to hear your take on the torture. If you unmute your microphone, the Rapporteur on Torture's report. I think you've had a chance to read up on that. Can you give us your views once you've unmuted your microphone? No, he's not unmuted. Dan, you have to unmute. You have to unmute your mic.
Yeah, I'm trying to do it from my end.
There we go. There we go. Thank you, Dan, for joining us. So please give us your views on the torture report.
Okay, well, I was getting that this morning here in Berkeley from Australia to start with, from the Sydney Morning Herald. My friend Jeffrey Mason lives in Sydney, and he sent it to me right away. and then I've seen the New York Times, and I've seen your piece. Joe, I haven't had a chance to read that in detail. I did. I also got the message from Sweden, where a number of people are getting signatures on a petition from Sweden to their government that they should not extradite Julian Assange to the U.S. for a number of reasons. They are more interested than I expect them to be in the effect on free press in America. I thought, they won't think of that as their problem, but they do find that as a significant reason not to extradite him, as well as the bad treatment they were expecting looking at Chelsea Manning earlier. That was before this torture report came out. And I just have a message from Sweden now, saying that this new report on torture will strengthen their hand very much in making this petition. They're trying to get prominent Swedes, and they say they have a lot of signatures already. I'm not at all surprised by this report. I'm very distressed by it as a friend of Julian. It so happens that I have, like many people, been very dismayed at some of his judgments in the last couple of years. The belief, which is shared by other people that I respect, but I don't agree with it, that Trump looked to them less dangerous than Hillary Clinton. And I certainly agreed entirely with the dangers that I saw in Hillary Clinton in foreign affairs, in her interventionist and pro-arms budget positions. But it didn't seem to me sensible to think that Trump would be less bad, actually. Now, however, I wasn't willing to express that publicly, particularly for two reasons. One, that I didn't want to give any support, even inferentially, to the idea that he deserved his conditions that he was living under, the quasi confinement, or the actual confinement, the quasi imprisonment that he was suffering, and to give any grounds for anybody to support or fail to oppose the British coming in and grabbing him. And the second reason was that I wasn't prepared to condemn a friend for whatever his judgment was, who had been in prison, in confinement for 6 and then 7 years entirely. As I've often said, I wouldn't trust my own judgment under those conditions. And I give a lot of slack, and more than that, I just wasn't willing to judge him harshly for whatever disagreement I had with him, which was strong over the last couple of years, under those conditions. Well, now, during that time, I was reading people saying, oh, there's no fear of his being extradited. That's not what he's afraid of, either from Sweden or Britain. He's just hiding out from Swedish justice. I had no doubt in my mind, having talked to him, even before he went to the Ecuadorian embassy, and then when I visited him twice in the Ecuadorian embassy, that he was perfectly prepared to face charges if they were brought against him. And so far as I know, they still haven't been brought against him as formal charges, although there's an arrest order for him, in a Swedish court, if he could be assured that he would not be extradited. And many people mocked that and said, no, that's not an issue. He really just didn't. I thought that was stupid or naive or ignorant. All the time, I had no doubt at all that the U.S. would try to extradite him. And as a matter of fact, with his first charge that came out against him, the first indictment a few weeks ago, which only exposed him to 5 years in prison, I was sure that was just trying to reassure the British that they could extradite him and not get into problems of political issues. I felt certain that the government the executive branch would not be willing to put Julian Assange away for only 5 years if they had him in their hands. So I was sure there would be another indictment. And of course, the second indictment that came along not only confirmed what those of us close to him had known all along, that he had every reason to expect an attempt to imprison him in the U.S., but my own guess that they would try to put him away in the same fashion that Nixon tried to put me away in the same charges, the Espionage Act charges. I was the first to face those charges for giving information to the American public. And in what, at that time, legal scholars like Melville Nimmer said was unconstitutional. was in the light of the First Amendment. But even then, and I was charged with 11 counts of violations of the Espionage Act, and one count of which was each worth 10 years, and then one additional count of conspiracy. Oh, there were some charges of theft in there also, but it ended up to 115 years. And of course, in Julian's case, a lot of people have been saying he's up for 170 years because of 17 counts on the Espionage Act. In fact, he has also a count on conspiracy worth 5 years, so it's 175 years. Now, the difference between 175 and 115, I'm glad to defer to him on that honor. It shows inflation, I think, over the years. But there's obviously no difference. They're talking life sentences in each case. In fact, they may have overreached in terms of public reaction on this one, as was true in my case. I wasn't unhappy, I have to tell you, that they did present me with a 115-year possible sentence, because it dramatized the issue and made it look overbearing, as is true in this case. Now, on the question, though, of torture, the second time that I visited him, I was very worried about his physical condition. I had already, and this was years ago, I forget exactly the year, a number of years ago, his shoulder was already giving him a lot of trouble. He needed an MRI for that, couldn't do it in the Ecuadorian embassy. He also had dental problems that needed a good, dental examinations that he couldn't get in Ecuador. And so I was worried, he didn't look good to me. Much worse deterioration since the first time I visited him several years earlier. And so I've been very worried. As soon as I heard he was in there, I've been asking everybody, is he getting the medical attention that he needs? And what I heard back was, you may have heard this already on the program, but he was getting what other prisoners got. They weren't trying to single him out, as has been done in the past by people that the Americans captured in Iraq, deliberately not attending to their physical needs, their injuries, as a form of torture, basically. But that apparently is not happening. But I, of course, then was very concerned to hear that now from the rapporteur, and I think from someone else earlier, his own lawyer, that he couldn't really communicate with them adequately. He was has a kind of traumatic problem at this point. So all that is very consistent with what I'd seen and what I've worried about all this time. I'm very glad to see that the rapporteur has defined this as psychological torture, and has not refrained from condemning the nations in charge of this, or who could have acted, including Australia, which has, of course, essentially abandoned him as a citizen, whatever they say about it. And I hope that will jerk them into getting him some proper attention, at least. Incidentally, I'm reminded that the rapporteur, earlier, not the same guy, rapporteur for the UN on torture, had tried to see Chelsea Manning, then Bradley Manning, in jail in Quantico and elsewhere, and was not allowed to see her privately, at least. Obviously, for a proper examination, it had to be private. They wouldn't allow that. And he described her solitary confinement at that point as approaching torture, but he didn't have a real examination. Well, Julian, of course, has had this now for years. And the Swedes, who have already now been saying that their government should not send him because of the example of Chelsea Manning treatment, obviously that's even more confirmed now. So, what to say? Obama used to say, torture is not us. That's not who we are. Well, who we are is what we do. And we've tortured, as Obama put it rather disgracefully, we tortured some folks. And of course, not one of them to be tried, let alone convicted for that process. The only person going to prison in connection with the illegal, in 7 different ways, illegal and criminal torture process was John Kiriakou, who was charged with revealing the name of a torturer. It reminds me of the fact that before I was even arrested back in 1971, I told someone, Institute of Policy Studies, I'm going to be the only one who goes to prison in connection with the Vietnam War. That war went on for 30 years, was illegal from start to finish, every aspect of it, innumerable war crimes committed. And now, after so many years later, I look back and it occurred to me, I'm the only one who went to trial. By a miracle, I didn't go to prison, miraculous said, but I'm the one who went to trial for the Vietnam War. Funny thought.
Could I ask?
Yeah.
Sorry. No, I was just going to ask a question.
Sure.
When the Nixon administration, they went after you and the Espionage Act and so on, and then the charges against you were thrown out because of the various abuses of the Nixon administration. What if there hadn't been those abuses? Do you think you would have been convicted?
Oh, almost surely, and not because of the nature of the law, actually, or any previous president. Melville Nimmer, who was mentioned earlier, who is the leading authority on the law of information in the country, and I'm told most cases having been basically publication, cases of various kinds, said at the time that by any previous president, Daniel Ellsberg should not have faced these charges of either theft or Espionage Act charges. And if the laws were so applied, they would be unconstitutional in the light of the First Amendment. And he wrote that as an amicus brief for the court, and then later in a law review article. And that was confirmed by some other legal scholars later. Now, the law has somewhat changed on that, especially on the law of theft. At that time, you weren't guilty of theft for copying information because the originals stayed with the owner. They weren't deprived of any use of their originals, and that was not a matter of theft. There was civil copyright aspects, but no criminal aspects. I understand that's changed because of the digital era, and now there are provisions for stealing information, which wouldn't have applied to me at that time properly, even though I was charged. And the Espionage Act, of course, had never been used against a source. When I talked about the similarity in the charges between me and I'll get to your point in just a second, between me and Julian, there is a vast difference. Still, not in the length of the charge, but in applying the Espionage Act to me, they were applying it to a source and somebody who had made promises to the government that I would not reveal that information. I broke those promises. And the question was, did that make me liable to criminal prosecution under the Espionage Act? And Nimmer thought not. But in the case of Julian, he never made such promises. He's not even an American citizen, of course. But aside from that, he's a member of the press, and people question that, but disingenuously, as far as I can see. He publishes information in the public interest that's newsworthy, that gets prizes for people when they reprint it. Actually, journalistically, he's treated as a journalist all the time. So this is the first use of any law, including the Espionage Act, to criminalize the normal activities of an investigative journalist, or any kind of journalist, really, especially when looking at national security affairs, where issues of classification arise. He is the first that they have used any act to prosecute, and specifically the Espionage Act, which there was no question that in passing the Espionage Act, so-called, in 1917, the legislators said, we do not want a British Official Secrets Act. And the British Official Secrets Act applies both to sources of information, like me, and to the journalists who reprint them. They were using it now already like a British Official Secrets Act with respect to sources. And journalists, media press in general, were not addressing the legal aspects or the constitutional aspects of this. I can hardly remember a single story during my 2 years in court of a journalist even making the point that no one else had ever been prosecuted for this, or that there were strong constitutional questions on it. And they've never worried about the constitutional issues. I made many, many lectures to journalists and judges, none of whom knew the legal aspects of this, because there had been hardly any cases. But above all, because it wasn't pointed at them, that is, the journalists. They weren't coming after them. So as long as it was just after these informants, these snitches, these sources, who were on their own, the journalists weren't worrying about it. Now they have awakened to the fact that law can be used against them. And by the way, the language was always there to do it. It was just, as I kept warning people, it was just that they understood, the prosecutors, that it was so likely to be found unconstitutional that they didn't do it to journalists. And they experimented with me as a source. And since then, there have been about a dozen people prosecuted as sources, 9 of them under Obama. But this is the first. And as we all know, I'm sure you've been discussing this, Obama wanted to prosecute, convict, and imprison, if not dismember and assassinate or whatever by drone, Julian Assange. They hated him. They investigated prosecuting him and backed off from it because it was just too obviously unconstitutional. And by the way, I don't think they're that worried in any of these administrations about doing something unconstitutional if they could get away with it. The trouble was that if that law is called unconstitutional, it's the only one they have to threaten people with. And they would be deprived, because we don't have a formal, explicit Official Secrets Act. So they were afraid that the court would go against them and they would be deprived of this threat against them, which could remain credible as long as it weren't tested in court. So now they are testing it. Coming back in, finally, what would have happened had not the government tried to incapacitate me at one point, overhear me with warrantless wiretaps, use the CIA against me, which was then illegal. All of this now being legalized since 9/11, but at that time it was all illegal and criminal. So that led to the dismissal of my charges when it was revealed. If it had not been revealed, however, what would have happened? Well, we talked to the jurors afterwards, and they were not convinced by the national security arguments. We had witnesses like George Bundy, John Kenneth Galbraith, and others testifying on our side, not for me personally, but saying that national security was not threatened by these revelations. A number of other people. So the jury was impressed by that, and by my testimony on the thing, my motives and so forth, which inferentially, I wasn't allowed to answer the question, why did you copy the Pentagon Papers, or say anything about my motives or the lies, anything else, because that was irrelevant under the Espionage Act, meaning that a source cannot be justly tried, fairly tried, under the Espionage Act, which is a strict liability act in which motive is not an element, is not relevant. So Julian, even sources like Chelsea Manning could not get a fair trial in those circumstances. And none of them have had fair trials. Most of them have copped a plea, being faced with sentences like the one Julian is facing now. And rather than face a 100-year sentence, they've made a plea bargain that has sent several of them to prison. In my case, I think, I won't go through it all, I'll just say, since the judge had been offered his life's ambition, which later Governor Jerry Brown, but then a lawyer, told me had been Matthew Byrne life ambition. He knew Byrne as a colleague, to replace J. Edgar Hoover as head of the FBI. And Hoover finally died during my trial, and Byrne was offered being head of the FBI, as a matter of fact. If it had not been revealed that this offer had been made to him, I think the number 2 man in the FBI who wanted that job himself leaked that so-called deep throat. Almost certainly was the source of that leak. That was embarrassing to the judge, but he didn't dismiss the trial then because he said it had no effect on him. Being offered that job, hadn't influenced them at all. So he dismissed our motion to dismiss the trial on that ground. But then when the warrantless wiretapping and the other stuff came out, yes, had it not come, he finally had really little choice but to dismiss the trial. Judges we heard all over the country were saying, reading the newspapers, why is that trial still going on? When it was revealed, how many different criminal acts had been taken against me, and the offer to the judge, which other judges didn't dismiss quite as quickly as Judge Matthew Byrne did. I believe that the chance I would have been acquitted on all 12 counts was negligible. There would have been no chance of Judge Byrne getting at the end of the trial the head of the FBI had he acquitted me of 115 years worth of prison. So I think the chance that he would have given instructions on theft, this is my speculation, very confident, he would have given instructions on theft that almost nobody would have found any problem with. Everybody assumed that I had stolen these papers. And it was not, I wasn't clear in the law of that until Melville Nimmer made it clear that by copying them, I had not stolen them in a criminal sense at that time. So, but by saying, giving the jury instructions on the law, I think he would have assured that I would get at least 20 or 30 years in prison, and he would have become director of the FBI. So as I say, it was kind of a miracle that John Dean, Alex Butterfield, Elliot Richardson, various others did things they were not expected to do about the taping, about the crimes and so forth. They all broke ranks in various ways that could not have been predicted, and I got off. It was kind of a miracle.
Well, Dan, that's a fascinating story there. It's something you said earlier, that when the espionage charges against you were revealed, that there was strong public reaction against that. So I'm looking at a parallel now to this, the espionage charge against Assange last Thursday. There was a strong reaction by the likes of even Rachel Maddow and others in the mainstream media because their own self-interest was at stake out of no love for Julian Assange, clearly. Do you think now, combining that public reaction to the espionage charges against him with this torture report today, that the public opinion could make it more complicated to extradite him from either the UK or Sweden?
Oh, I think undoubtedly, yes. The answer to all that is yes. I want to make one correction here, which I'm one of the few people to notice. He's always, in nearly all his stories, they call that he's accused of espionage. Now, his is a special case. Let's compare it, say, to Chelsea Manning. Who was it, Pompeo, did say earlier, Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, is a hostile intelligence service. And they may think of that as virtually spying. Virtually. It's not clear legally now. But the mere use of the Espionage Act does not imply, in all the other cases, it did not imply that they were charging him with spying or espionage. Here's the confusion. There is no law officially titled Espionage Act, little known fact. In the US Code, there is 18 USC 793 paragraphs D and E. Now, why can I roll that off? I'm not a lawyer. I'm a defendant. And those are the charges that were raised against me. So I know that one very well. 18 USC 793 paragraphs D and E, which were designed only for spies and were used prior to my case only against spies who essentially give information secretly to a foreign power without the US government or the public knowing what is told or that it had been told, and essentially for the interests of the other power and against the interests of the United States, and perhaps for money or various other motives that would not sit well with a jury, even if they were presented. My case was the first use of the so-called Espionage Act, as I say so-called because it had only been designed and used against spies, in a non-espionage case and non-espionage charges. Now, Chelsea and all these other people who have been convicted or put under Obama were not actually being regarded as spies, though the public may have thought so. They were being tried like me on non-espionage charges under 18 USC, under the non. So Manning may or may not be, they may or may not regard his case as different because of this hostile intelligence service aspect. But other journalists from the New York Times who are as liable to prosecution as Julian Assange, New York Times, Washington Post, any of the others, the language applies to them. they won't actually be charged with espionage, which, as you say, Joe, does get a public reaction of, what? What do you mean? Who are they spying for? The public? You mean you're coming right out and saying the public is the enemy? That's what the people in the government think privately, and they talk to each other. What's different about Trump? He says publicly what officials have always said privately. He comes right out and says publicly, the media is the enemy of the public. Previously said only the Stalinist regime, basically, about dissenters and questioners and so forth. And that's true, of his racism and of so many other things. Nixon was as racist on the tapes as Trump, more so than Trump. But the difference is that Trump says it more or less publicly, not just in private. So in this case, finally, they're not really being charged with espionage. One little interesting historical fact. The prosecutor in my case made David Nissen, a Mormon, made I'm sorry to discriminate here. I just happen to hate David Nissen. I don't hate Mormons. He had brought my son in when he was about 13 into the grand jury, came for him at 7 a.m, sent him into the grand jury without a lawyer, even in the hall and so forth. So every time I looked at my prosecutor, David Nissen, for 2 years, I was seeing the guy who had tried to get my son at 13 to testify against his father. I didn't really like that. My lawyer said, Boudin, he'd never known of a mafia case where they tried to use their young sons against them or daughters. Anyway, that's all by the way. But the point is that Nissen made a motion in court that the word espionage or Espionage Act not be uttered in the courtroom. And the judge accepted that directive. And why? Well, we weren't inclined to use it anyway, of course. Well, we might have, because, of course, Nissen worried that would look so absurd to the jury, it would prejudice them against his prosecution, that they were calling me a spy for giving information to the American public. So he couldn't even use the word espionage. So all of that now is this, yes, the misunderstanding that he's being charged with spying and espionage may serve his purpose. It is a misunderstanding, and I'm not really trying to clear that up all that, but just for the record, that's the way it is. They don't have to regard you as a spy to charge you now under the language of the 18 U.S.C., which has always been there, saying someone, in the case of paragraph E, without authorization to have this information, gives it to someone else who doesn't have authorization, who may in turn turn it on. Well, that's not just the journalists, that's the readers. When you read in the New York Times saying this is a classified, well, right now, the British, I don't know if it's classified, but somebody just leaked the report of the rapporteur to the British government on Monday. So it's a leak. I don't know, they probably didn't call it classified. But every time you read something that is described as classified in the US, you are potentially chargeable with holding on to, possessing information you don't have a right to have. If you hand that newspaper to your spouse or your child or whoever, you're distributing it in the words of the law. And if you don't, quote, turn it over to the proper authorities. What? Turn in your copy to the New York Times. To who exactly? They should print at the top, all the news fit to print. And if any of this is classified, here's the address to send it to dispossess yourself of it. Well, you could say over these last years, 50 years almost, since my case, well, the language is there, but, it's ridiculous. They wouldn't use it. Well, it applied to journalists, and they've just used it. And as a matter of fact, one last thing, I guess it was Manning, yes, whose material was, of course, classified. People were being told by the State Department in graduate schools, looking at internet. If any of you, this is a paraphrase, but very close. If any of you have in mind downloading from your computer this information that Julian Assange has just put out, which is classified, that will have a bearing on your ability to get a clearance or keep a clearance, because you are violating the regulations. Indeed, And by the way, that was very much applied to people in the government on their computers. Do not download the New York Times on this story. I think a lot of you would find it difficult to believe what I'm just saying, but as they say, look it up. You can look it up. It's amazing. The truth is that in the government offices, they were not. They were guilty of having their clearance removed and thus losing their job and their family. And now being prosecuted if they download this stuff without authorization. I would say, by the way, Jeremy Scahill, just to pick a name at random here, who is identified as the journalist to whom Daniel Hale gave some top secret documents I just read. The government didn't identify the person he gave them to, but media sources have that's leaked. So it's Jeremy Scahill, apparently, of The Intercept. Well, Jeremy, I hope, is getting legal advice right at this point, because he is absolutely liable under this interpretation of that wording for prosecution, and whether that would be upheld by the Supreme Court remains to be seen. They have never addressed this question. The Samuel Loring Morrison case, 10 years after mine, went up to the Supreme Court after a conviction, almost the only jury conviction there's been in this instance, and they refused it. They refused certiorari. So the Supreme Court has never ruled whether the Espionage Act can be used against any leaker or journalist. Now, what's happening right now? Why are they doing this right now? I'll give you one guess. Let me give you two guesses. First, they have a new Supreme Court. And for the same reason that abortion laws are not springing up like spring blossoms all over the place right after Kavanaugh gets on the Supreme Court, and they're hoping for a 5-4 decision overruling Roe versus Wade. So all of a sudden, we're seeing all these cases being brought and legislation being brought of an obviously unconstitutional character, as in Alabama and elsewhere, to get it up to the Supreme Court in hopes that this Supreme Court will now go along with it. I think, and I haven't seen anybody else say that, that's why we're seeing the first journalist case go up. Why not 2 years ago? Why not under George W. Bush or Obama? Well, the court wasn't great then. It wasn't the court I faced. Black and Douglas would never have allowed this which I faced, would never have allowed this case to even be heard. I don't think they would vote against this even being heard by the Supreme Court. They would just rule the act unconstitutional in that purpose. But now we've got a new Supreme Court. And the second reason, in my mind, speculation, we know that the National Security Assistant is Bolton, is pressing the government to conduct a crime against the peace in Iraq, an aggressive war, as clearly criminal if he initiates that war, and even if he gins up a false flag provocation of some sort, as clearly criminal as anything tried at Nuremberg or Tokyo or going into Kuwait by the Russians, or are going into Iraq. Now, Trump opposed, he says, not at the beginning, but later, our having gone into Iraq. Fine, he doesn't want that. We're hearing he doesn't like Bolton pressing him into a war with Iran. I think that's because it's too soon. A war with Iran would clearly look awful by the time we got to the election in November 2020. This is not the time to start a war. Bolton doesn't care about the election. So Trump rightly perceives that Bolton doesn't have Trump's incentives in mind totally. Bolton has wanted that war for 20 years. It should have happened last month, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. He wanted it under George W. Bush. So he's not worrying about Bolton's election chances, but Trump. But Trump can say, no, we don't want a big war. A year and a half before the election, it'll look like a catastrophe, which it will be. But if we have it in October, the famous October season for surprises, October surprise season, before an election, well, then people will rally around the flag. Great experience of that practically every time, as John Kennedy was bemused by the fact that his popularity went up after the Bay of Pigs. And he spoke to people and said, what is this? How come my popularity has gone up? We've just had a debacle here. And the answer being that the people rally around the flag under these circumstances. So that would be a good time. If his back is to the wall because of impeachment proceedings, well, he knows he doesn't have to worry about conviction. But an impeachment in the House would not help him probably in the election, although, it might in terms of getting Republicans to the polls and so forth. But anyway, he may or may not want to chance that. But if he's really in trouble because of possible prosecution or real scandals that have come out more than before, I think a war is very much to be expected, a wag the dog kind of war. And moreover, of course, in general, he doesn't want anything more coming out from the Mueller investigation or all these cases that are coming out. In short, this is a president who has every reason to want to shut down the free press. There's never been a president who had more reason to want to discard the First Amendment at this moment, not just for Iran, but for all his domestic reasons. So investigative journalists, leaks. Mueller somehow managed not to have leaks. He did that. But now they're coming out. And the president wants that shut down. So I think that's why we're getting this case right now. And a prosecution of Julian Assange will very much have that effect. In fact, this indictment already, I think, will have some effect. Journalists will have to be thinking of themselves as more vulnerable than they ever did before in our country's history.
So, Dan, do you anticipate then a challenge to the courts if he's prosecuted that of the sections D and E, as you were saying, as being unconstitutional?
There's no question about it. The challenge will be made at every stage of the thing on the unconstitutional level. By the way, I was told just a few years ago, in other words, 40 years after the case, by the law clerk to Justice Matt Byrne. And we had made a motion. I was hardly aware of it at the time, but the lawyers made a motion that the charges on the espionage act should be dismissed on grounds that the act so applied was unconstitutional. The act wasn't meant to shut down information. Okay, what this law clerk, and this is not a secret now, he said I could say this, said, he wrote a memo. He was just out of Harvard Law School. He wrote a memo saying the defendant's brief is valid. It's true. It should be struck down as unconstitutional. This is the beginning of the trial, more or less. And I said, well, what did Byrne think of that? He said, well, as far as I could tell, he agreed with me. But after thinking about it, this was his first case. So he didn't want to, and by the way, he was already being mentioned as a potential successor to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. So the law clerk, his assistant told me, so he decided he wouldn't do it at the beginning of the case, start his first case by throwing out a major piece of legislation on grounds of unconstitutionality. He says, we'll wait till the proceedings have gone along, see, and then I'll rule with it at the end of the case. And, having heard this and so forth, I now find this is an inappropriate thing. That was not, of course, an assurance that he would do that, but he postponed the decision. And of course, at the very end, it was coming out he'd been twice with with John Ehrlichman, once with the president to discuss FBI. The other stuff was coming out, and he never got a chance to say this was unconstitutional. And we didn't know that ourselves. By the way, here's this case coming against Assange, against the source. But 5 justices, 4 explicitly and 1 implicitly on the Supreme Court during the Supreme Court case, civil case of the injunction, said, of course, there could be a prosecution, a criminal prosecution. They even, several of them implied, and it's obviously guilty, this was not just against the source, the Times. And what people didn't know at the time, or hardly anybody knows now, was Nixon was pursuing a case, just like Assange's, against Hedrick Smith and Neil Sheehan of the New York Times. He had a grand jury in Boston on that. And, Boston. They went after me, I think, in Los Angeles. So that was on the distribution. And that failed. They stopped that grand jury only because of the way my case ended, because they'd obviously been overhearing all of those people at the time without warrants. So we didn't get a case like Assange's then under Nixon, and not till now has it been brought. Anyway, here we have the judges saying, yes, of course you can prosecute the New York Times criminally, you just can't enjoin them prior restraint. The First Amendment is against that. So, however, I look back on that. Of course, Black and Douglas didn't say anything like that, but 5 of them did. And I look back and I say, well, those are Supreme Court justices. I'm certain none of them knew anything about what they were saying. Everybody assumed I was breaking a law, as did Nixon or Kissinger. I'm sure this breaks all kinds of laws and so forth. Well, no. In England, yes. America, no. We didn't have an Official Secrets Act. So how could the judges be so ignorant of the law? There'd never been a case like mine. They hadn't learned it in law school. They didn't read about it. There were no cases. But my lawyers felt, well, like me, must be a law broken here. Everybody assumed that. And I was always described as stealing it and so forth. So it took them a whole year of searching for what, not a lawyer, I'm a defendant here, but what the legal language is, unrecorded cases that had not come to an end, were dropped out somewhere or didn't lead to an appeal. Acquittals and whatnot. There might be a case somewhere that there was no appellate court opinion recorded. So after a year into this trial, which started in 71, in 72, my lawyer, Leonard Boudin, big constitutional lawyer, says, Dan, calls me and says, Dan, it's coming to look as though you haven't broken any law. And I said, what? What do you mean? He says, well, we've been looking for a year now through all possible unrecorded cases all over the country. There's never been a prosecution like yours. And apparently the reason is that there's no law that you've broken. So I said, well, great. So I'm home free. He says, no, it isn't quite like that. It isn't quite like that. When you go into a courtroom and the USA says, United States of America against Daniel Ellsberg, 12 felony counts, you can't be sure you're going to walk out of there free. I said, well, what are my odds? He said, 50-50. He said, 50-50, and I haven't broken any law? And he said, well, let's face it, Dan, copying 7,000 pages of top secret documents and giving them to the New York Times has a bad ring to it. So I wasn't at all assured. And as I say, we weren't aware then that the judge was being bribed, essentially, or was about to be bribed and corrupted. After all, I'm not even condemning him all that much. You're offered a position you've wanted all your life, which has only arisen once with J. Edgar Hoover. He was actually the second head of the FBI, but he'd practically been the only director they'd ever had. The job is now open. If only he gives instructions on theft, which would be like nearly what everyone assumed they would be, except for somebody who knew the law, like Melville Nimmer, especially. So could he really turn that down? I don't condemn him too much, but that's human.
Was it Mark Felt who disclosed about the John Ehrlichman's offer? Was it Felt who revealed that?
Oh yeah, I'm certain it was Mark Felt. Mark Felt had wanted that job. He was what do they call him? A big mouth, deep throat. Similar metaphor.
Because Felt then subsequently did in Pat Gray, because Pat Gray got the job that Felt wanted.
So he was very angry that Pat Gray, who had little legal experience actually, but was a friend of Nixon. So Pat Gray gets a job, and then Gray is, as Ehrlichman put it, hanging slowly in the wind in his confirmation hearings, when it turns out that he had burned the documents relating to me and to efforts against me and whatever with his Christmas trash, his Christmas wrappings in his fireplace. He destroyed evidence. after being urged by John Dean to do so. So he's out, and now the case is open again, and it's going to Ruckel's house. How did it work? Oh, Kleindienst. I forget. I'm a little woozy here at this moment for a reason I'll tell you in a minute. Then I lost a couple attorney generals over this case. John Mitchell was indicted the day my case was ended. The headline going into the courtroom was John Mitchell, who had indicted me. Indicted, and so forth. And then, of course, Kleindienst, who replaced him as acting director, he had to cop a plea. And at the end of the trial, a few hours later, when the court had dismissed the trial, I came out with face reporters, and they said, well, what are you going to do now? And I was asked that several times. I gave two answers. One is, well, I've been in court for 2 years now. I don't think I'll go cold turkey. I guess we'll go to other people's trials for a while. And but of course, my wife was not going to let me do that. And so another question was, okay, what are you going to do now? I said, I want to make love with my wife in every climate, every kind of climate. But I forgot what your question was. Was that related?
No, I was just wondering about how it was exposed, the John Ehrlichman's offer. And I was just wondering whether it was Mark Feld who exposed that.
Oh, yes. Well, it just came out in the, okay, we're going on here, but it's like Assange. This is what he'll be going through. It's leaked. First of all, let's see. We get a message. Judge Byrne on April 26th, I believe it was, 1973, calls everybody up to the bench out of the hearing of the jury, the defense lawyers, the prosecutors, and me, and Tony Russo, the co-conspirators. He says, I've just gotten a message here from the special prosecutor, Spencer, that on the orders of the White House, government agents went into the office of your, Daniel Ellsberg's, former psychoanalyst, Louis Fielding, to get information to blackmail me into silence with. He said, the former psychoanalyst, he says, then he turns to me for the first time in 2 years, looks me in the eye, because I was a non-person all this time. He looked at the lawyers always, never me, never addressed anything to me. And for the first time, he looks at me and he says, I don't have to release this. I can keep it sealed. Meaning, I don't have to tell this Los Angeles audience that you had a psychoanalyst. I said, first time addressing him directly, are you kidding? Put it out. So a scene from the play and movie Front Page then occurs. He reads this to the court. Every journalist dashes out of the courtroom for the payphones to say that Watergate has just reached the Pentagon Papers case, which was very exciting to them because while Watergate was going on in Washington, they were stuck here listening to this extremely dull stuff about national security and so forth. They were really out of it. So they were very excited. Okay, so that happens. Then he asks for various things, which he doesn't get, to demonstrate this in various ways. Then the word comes out in the Washington Star, I believe it was then, that he had been offered the head of the FBI director just recently, weeks earlier. And so we get a message from Washington that this is something that has never been told, but here I'm kind of giddy here in trial, so I'm going on. He gets a message from Washington that the Washington Star in the morning, remember 3 hours time difference, has revealed this. So it turns out that Charlie Nesson, my Harvard Law School friend and professor, a now friend, who is the second in command in the legal team, had gone in and told Judge Byrne that we were going to raise this in court. And so he comes out with a written statement, which he had prepared. The other lawyers in my case, in particular Leonard Weinglass, who had represented the Chicago 8 and various other anti-war people, was much more of a let's say, 60s, defense lawyer. Charlie had had no criminal experience. He was a law professor. Leonard had had a lot of experience. Weinglass went out of his mind with rage on this, that he had told Byrne instead of having exposed in the courtroom, directly, confronting him. What? Have you just been, is this true? Have you been off of the FBI? And other lawyers who were other quite radical, the young paralegal people, so just raged. And they said, that shows that Charlie from Harvard Law School is just an establishment person. He's an East Coast person. Charlie just, I was just trying to, be reasonable here and give him warning. So he comes out and says that, et cetera. He had been offered this, but of course he hadn't discussed the case, and, it didn't affect him anything. A couple days later, the word comes out again that he had seen Ehrlichman a second time at Byrne's request. And although, again, Byrne said, this didn't have any influence on me, and I didn't discuss the case, Ehrlichman testified what he recently wanted to talk was to tell him his plans for the FBI. What did he want to do in the FBI when he got it? And so, in other words, there was a second meeting. And Byrne always said there was no discussion of the case at all, except that fall, I'm watching NBC, which is showing home movies done by H.R. Haldeman, the president's chief of staff. And he had an 8mm camera, and he always used to use to take photos of visits with visiting luminaries, whatnot, heads of state and things. So they were showing his home movies for 2 hours. And there I see my judge walking across the lawn at San Clemente, heavy watered lawn down in the desert there, and Nixon coming up with Ehrlichman to meet him, while Ehrlichman, who's going to introduce them, is standing by them, and Haldeman is there with his 8mm camera taking all that. So I watched my judge walk across the lawn, shake hands with Nixon, who, in shaking his hand, says, "Well, Judge, it's taking you as long to end that Ellsberg trial as it took me to end the Vietnam War." I was pleased in that exchange because, of course, the whole point of it was that they wanted that trial over before they had to put into court all the things that had been done against me, at this point, which was, like the burglary, which was about to come out. And finally, when they, after 2 weeks of telling the, of Nixon telling Kleindienst, acting attorney general, and Peterson, the head of the criminal division, not to tell the judge what Dean had revealed to them about the burglary because it was national security. And finally, after 2 weeks, Kleindienst and Peterson go into Nixon and say, "We'll have to resign if you don't give this to the court, because that would be obstruction of justice." Ever heard that question raised about a president before? You'll be committing justice. We're not going to do it with you. So he says, "Okay, send it down to the court." And that night, we know from the tapes, he's talking to Kleindienst, and Klein says, "I'm really sorry about this, Mr. President," and so forth. And Nixon says, for the first time, the word impeachment is used in the tapes. And Nixon says, "Well, they'll talk about impeachment, but then they'll get Agnew. How will they like that?" The tape now would be Pence, of course, Trump's impeachment insurance. But at that time, Nixon had Agnew. If you impeach Nixon, you get Agnew, until Agnew is forced to resign later with a plea bargain because he had accepted envelopes of cash relating to bribes he took as governor of Maryland, as the vice president. One who called me a traitor. And so he made a plea bargain, some sort of, not mentioning it on his taxes or something, the envelopes of cash that he got. So Nixon loses his impeachment insurance. He's now naked there, so eventually he put Rockefeller in. A lot of Nelson Rockefeller as vice president. So I remember there was discussion of Rockefeller, of the Rockefeller family, and Standard Oil, whether there was possibly a conflict of interest in his being vice president. I remember Patricia, my wife, saying to me, how could there be a conflict of interest between Rockefeller and the U.S. government? Their interests are indistinguishable. But anyway, so it goes. And now finally more interesting. The reason I've been talking down straight for hours because just before getting on this, I was talking to a presidential candidate, Tulsi Gabbard. And, that's name dropping here, even though I'm afraid she's at the 1% level in support so far, but who knows where that will go. Now, actually, I saw her because she has excellent positions on nuclear weapons, on foreign policy in general. She's against regime change wars. She may have invented that phrase, which very good, very good. So I was glad to talk to her about the nuclear weapons issue. But this very morning, I was getting this stuff about torture of Julian. She is, as far as I know, the one member of Congress, tell me if there are others, who has said on the air, Julian Assange charges should be dropped and Snowden should be pardoned. If somebody else has said that, I'd like to hear it, but I haven't heard it. And she was interviewed here, ever saying, got it. She said she was shocked when she read the details of the mass surveillance. By the way, that was a factor in my case, the surveillance of me without a warrant from Snowden. There was something Snowden uncovered and released, something I didn't know that even as members of Congress, which she'd been, we would have been aware of, should have been aware of, she means. So now that we are aware of it, we can take action to close those loopholes, to change those policies, to protect our civil liberties. Was this NSA going to disclose that information voluntarily? Absolutely not, she says. And then she says, on the Assange arrest, this is before the torture, the fact that the Trump administration has chosen to ignore how important it is that we uphold our freedoms, did you read this earlier? And go after him. It has a very chilling effect on both journalists and publishers, and also on every one of us as Americans. It was a warning call saying, look what happened to this guy. It could happen to you. It could happen to any one of us. She goes on there. So here I was, a pre-scheduled meeting with the one purpose in Congress that I know of, but I hope there will be more, who is saying very clearly, this is wrong. Assange should not face charges, nor should Snowden, and he should be pardoned. So whatever else you hear about Tulsi Gabbard, or whether you agree with her on this or that, I agree with her on lots of things. We should all be aware this is a person who is carrying the torch on this one, on the First Amendment.
Absolutely. No, I'm not aware of any other current congressperson who's come out that strongly. Even Bernie Sanders, although he did make a statement about the 17 extra indictments, he didn't name Assange, did not come out strongly against the prosecution of Assange and the imprisonment of Chelsea Manning. He's been basically silent. So that's definitely disappointing. And Oscar was telling us earlier that even there have been no Australian politicians either who've stood up against this, unfortunately.
Only the foreign minister.
Former, right.
Foreign Minister Bob Carr, he did come out in Assange's defense. Dan, that was incredibly fascinating stuff. Particularly what you said about the fact that you think this indictment of Assange on the Espionage Act came because of the composition of this court. They think they'll be able to withstand a challenge. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I am saying that just as they're hoping this court will overturn Roe versus Wade, Trump is hoping that this court will overturn the First Amendment. And he could be right.
Amazing.
And we have had Mike Gravel come out against this as well, but he's not a current representative. So I think
he wanted me to endorse him, a buddy of mine, of course, who faced risk censure, came very close to it for reading the Pentagon Papers into the record. Two things about him. After the Democratic Congress failed to carry out the threatened impeachment of George W. Bush, which he richly deserved, and which Conyers, head of the Judiciary Committee, had written a book about the impeachment of George W. Bush. Now they have a Democratic House, and Conyers is told, by Nancy Pelosi, as a matter of fact, there will be no impeachment proceedings, on the fear that that would bring Republicans out to the polls and they wouldn't get the next president. And of course, especially when it turned out that Barack Obama was a potential nominee, Conyers could not have wanted to be, being African-American, the one who brought Republicans and prevented Barack Obama from being president. So there was no impeachment proceeding. But I said to Mike at that point, Mike, is this Congress extraordinarily cowardly? And he said, no, ordinarily cowardly. He said they were the same as in my day. And then he wanted me to endorse him in this race just now. And I sent back the word, friends do not encourage friends to run for president.
Funny thing, Mike is endorsing Tulsi.
Gabbard an hour ago, or whenever I started this. But I said, but of course, you're young enough. She's the age I was, 38, when I gave the Pentagon Papers to the Senate. She's less than half my age now. So I said, okay, you can run for president. But I didn't want Mike, who is using a cane now, I saw in the video. I didn't want Mike to run for president.
Well, he's endorsing Tulsi Gabbard, Mike Gravel is. That's what he's told me.
You did?
Yeah, he's not running to win. He's only running to get into the debates to make certain points. Are you endorsing Tulsi? Have you given your endorsement to anyone yet?
First of all, for various people, I would, but with Bernie in the race, no. I hope that Bernie will get it. Must say, but what's the chance? Very low, but worth working for. And she endorsed Bernie last time. She just said, why? I noticed that Judy Woodruff asked her, well, why are you running, this time? She said, well, I have foreign policy and military experience here on House Armed Services, House Foreign Affairs, which is true, actually. Bernie doesn't talk much about foreign affairs, unfortunately. So I hope that Bernie will listen to Tulsi Gabbard, and I'm pretty sure he agrees with her, and start talking about the issues and reducing the defense budget, getting rid of our doomsday machine and things. These are not subjects he's talked about, nor have any of the others, of course. And I would like to see both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders get on those issues now, not just on domestic. But Tulsi is bringing a very good foreign policy and defense perspective to those debates. So no, the chance of her being president would, seem negligible, not really much more than Mike Gravel's for various reasons. But I'm glad to see both of them get on the debates, yes.
And I just want to say thank you to Oscar Grenfell for joining us. He has to go work on an article at the moment, but thank you, Oscar, for sticking with us. I know it's early in Australia from where you're joining us from, so thank you.
Thanks very much.
Well, I'm also in Australia, and I've been up from very early in the morning as well. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you for letting me go on down memory lane here. But why am I going down memory lane? Because that act, which was first used against me almost half a century ago, has now been used against a journalist directly. That may get the journalists awake on this issue. And I would say this is the most severe attack on the First Amendment since the Supreme Court case against the New York Times and the prosecution of myself almost 48 years ago. So as I say, it does arouse memories, but it also energizes me to get back into this fight. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to George, and I thank Elizabeth, and I thank Peter B. Collins and Oscar. Am I missing somebody, Elizabeth?
Sam Husseini.
Sam Husseini. Yeah. Sam Husseini. Right. We've gone over time, but it was well worth it with Dan Ellsberg there to tell us some fascinating stuff. And I think we've covered it pretty well. What do you think?
I think so too. I think Dan's insight is always incredibly valuable. He has a completely unique perspective on this predicament that we find ourselves facing and that Assange is facing at the moment.
I always find these kinds of historical reminiscences endlessly fascinating. I could have gone on listening for another couple of hours, but
especially when it relates to something happening now, and that's Assange. That's why it's so valuable such insights. You can learn from the past to understand the present.
Definitely.
I'm going to sign off and say goodbye to everyone, and thanks for joining us. And we'll see you next Friday.
Thanks so much, Joe and Elizabeth, for organizing this.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. See you
Goodbye.
next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So I search for some